Hey, welcome back, my friend. If you are just finding this channel for the first time, I'm really glad you're here tonight. Get comfortable. Maybe pull that blanket a little closer, because what we are about to explore together is something most history teachers never told you. Let me ask you something. When you picture someone from 1,000 years ago, what do you see? Dirty hands, matted hair, a person who maybe never bathed once in their entire life. That image is burned into almost all of us. We grew up with it in movies, in textbooks, in jokes. The smelly medieval peasant, the unwashed villager, the king who bathed twice a year if he was feeling generous. But here is the thing. What if almost everything you were taught about hygiene in the ancient world was wrong? What if people who lived thousands of years before your hot shower and your lavender-scented body wash were actually in some ways cleaner than you think? And more importantly, what does the real story of human cleanliness tell us about who we truly are? That is what tonight is all about. Before we dive in, if you find yourself still awake by the end of this story and thinking, okay, that was genuinely fascinating, it would mean a lot if you hit that like button, leave a comment down below, or share this with someone who loves history as much as you do. No pressure at all. Only do it if you truly feel it. Oh, and one small thing I would love to know where you're watching this from tonight. Are you in bed? On the couch? Maybe with a cup of tea going cold on the nightstand? Drop it in the comments. I genuinely read every single one. Now dim the lights a little if you can. Maybe turn on a fan for some soft background noise. And let us begin tonight's journey together. All right. Let's start with a question that sounds almost too simple. Why do we even believe this story? Why does almost every person alive today carry this picture of the dirty, unwashed past? The answer, it turns out, is surprisingly recent. And surprisingly deliberate. Historians who study the way we talk about the Middle Ages have noticed something fascinating. The idea that medieval people were uniformly filthy, that the whole era was, quote, 1,000 years without a bath. That idea did not come from medieval people themselves. It came from the 19th century. Think about that for a moment. The 1800s were a time when Western societies were obsessed with the idea of progress, with science, with being modern, and nothing made modern people feel more modern than looking back at their ancestors and saying, "Look how far we've come. Look how dirty and primitive they were." It was useful, it was flattering, and it was largely invented. One historian put it beautifully. He said calling someone dirty has always been one of the oldest insults in human history, and the 19th century aimed that insult directly at anyone who came before them. So the first thing we need to do tonight before we travel through thousands of years of human history is let go of that story, because the real story is far more interesting. Now here is something I want you to hold on to as we go through this journey together. Cleanliness throughout all of human history has never been a simple thing. It has always been shaped by three forces. The first is wealth. Rich people in almost every era had access to more water, more time, and better tools for staying clean. Poor people did their best with what they had. That part has not really changed. The second force is religion. Almost every major civilization that ever existed had rituals of purification tied to faith. Washing was sacred before it was scientific, and that shaped everything. The third force is knowledge, or rather the lack of it. For most of human history, people had no idea what germs were. They had no concept of bacteria. They could not see the invisible world that was slowly killing them. But that did not mean they did not care about being clean. They cared enormously. They just had very different explanations for why cleanliness mattered. Keep those three forces in mind, wealth, religion, and knowledge, and suddenly the whole history of human hygiene starts to make a different kind of sense. Now let me give you something concrete. Something that will probably surprise you. 13th century Paris. The year is somewhere around 1290. Paris is a city of maybe 200,000 people. Narrow streets, yes. The occasional smell of something you would not want to identify absolutely. But here is what most people do not know about Paris in that era. It had 32 public bathhouses. 32. And those bathhouses were not quiet, solemn places. They were loud. They were social. Street vendors would walk outside them in the morning calling out to passers-by to come in and wash. People went to the baths to meet friends, to do business, to gossip, to relax after a week of hard labour. Sound familiar? Not so different from your local gym or spa, is it? And Paris was not unusual. In the same era, the city of Nuremberg in what is now Germany, widely considered one of the cleanest cities in medieval Europe, had 14 public bathhouses for a population far smaller than Paris. 14. One medieval writer, likely exaggerating but making the point all the same, claimed that Baghdad in that same century had 60,000 bathhouses. 60,000. That number is almost certainly inflated. But the point stands. The culture of public bathing was not a forgotten relic. It was alive, it was widespread, and it was deeply woven into daily life across much of the world. So how did we get so confused about this? Part of the answer lies in how we choose what stories to remember. Medieval monks, for example, really did write rules about bathing only a few times a year, and those rules survived, were copied, were quoted, and eventually became the image we have of an entire era. But here is the part that always gets left out. Those rules existed because people were bathing too much. Read that again. The church was telling people to slow down on the bathing, not because cleanliness was unimportant, but because public bathhouses had developed a reputation for being, shall we say, a little too lively. Dinner parties held over wooden planks laid across bathtubs, music playing in the corner, men and women bathing together with a frankness that made certain clergy extremely uncomfortable. The rules about bathing less were not about hygiene, they were about morality, and the two things got completely mixed up. There is also a fascinating psychological reason for why we love the dirty past story. It makes us feel safe. Think about it. If you believe the people in the past were filthy and ignorant, then history is a straight line upward. Progress is guaranteed. We are always getting better. But if you learn that Romans 2,000 years ago were using as much water per person per day as a modern American family uses in 4 days, suddenly that straight line gets a little wobbly. If you discover that ancient Egyptians had deodorant breath mints and skincare routines that would not look out of place on a beauty influencer's channel today, it becomes harder to feel comfortably superior. And maybe that is actually a good thing. Maybe the real lesson of the history of cleanliness is not that we have conquered something primitive. Maybe it is that the desire to be clean, to care for your body, to present yourself with dignity, that desire is as old as humanity itself. It does not belong to modernity, it belongs to all of us. Now, I also want to be honest with you tonight, because this story, like all real stories, is not perfectly clean, pun absolutely intended. There were places and times in history where hygiene genuinely collapsed, where disease spread because people stopped washing, where whole cities festered, where the gap between the wealthy and the poor meant that some people had access to clean water every single day, while others went weeks without anything more than a splash from a river. We're going to talk about all of that. The plague years, the water-fearing centuries, the kings who smelled so bad their own courtiers stood at a distance. Yes, that is a real thing, and yes, we're absolutely going to get into it, but I want you to carry the whole picture with you. Not just the dramatic, sensational parts, though, those are genuinely wild, but the nuanced human, sometimes surprisingly touching story of how billions of ordinary people throughout history did their best to stay clean with what they had. Because that story, I think, is far more interesting and far more human. So let us go back, way back, further than ancient Rome, further than the pyramids, all the way back to a time before cities, before writing, before anything we might recognize as civilization. Because the question of how people stayed clean before modern plumbing actually begins with a much more primal question. Before soap was invented, before bathhouses were built, before anyone had even imagined the concept of a water pipe, how did the very first humans get clean? The answer is going to take you somewhere you probably have not thought about before, and it starts with ash and oil, and a discovery so ancient it predates written language itself. Let's go there together. So we left off with a question hanging in the air, didn't we? Before soap existed, before anyone had built a bathhouse, before a single clay pipe carried water from one place to another, how did the very first humans get clean? And I want you to sit with that question for a second, really sit with it, because the answer reveals something quietly profound about what it means to be human. Here is what we know. The desire to be clean is not a modern invention. It is not something civilization taught us. It is older than civilization itself. Researchers who study animal behavior have noticed something fascinating. Almost every creature on Earth that has a nervous system also has some form of grooming behavior. Chimpanzees pick parasites off each other's skin. Ants scrub themselves to remove fungal spores. Even certain species of fish have been observed brushing themselves against rough surfaces to remove irritants. Hygiene, in other words, is not a habit we learned. It is something we were born carrying, and early humans were no different. Archaeological evidence, the kind that comes from caves and ancient campsites from fossilized bones, and the tools found buried alongside them tells us that Neanderthals, who lived more than 40,000 years ago, were already using seashell tweezers to pluck unwanted hair from their bodies. 40,000 years. Think about that. Cave paintings from this same era show men with clean, smooth faces. That is not artistic license. That is evidence that people were shaving using sharpened flint volcanic glass, even sharks' teeth, tens of thousands of years before the first metal razor was ever made. And then there was the discovery that changed everything. Nobody planned it. Nobody ran an experiment. It just happened one evening somewhere a very long time ago. Maybe it was near a cooking fire, animal fat dripping off a piece of meat running down into the hot ash below. Rain falling, the mixture pooling together, and some curious ordinary person whose name we will never know, reached down, touched that strange foamy substance, rubbed it between their palms, and noticed something. The grime on their hands came off differently, more completely, more easily than water alone ever managed. That person had just accidentally made soap. Now, whether that exact moment happened exactly that way, nobody can say for certain. But the chemistry behind it is absolutely real, and it has never changed. Fat plus ash plus water equals saponification, the same chemical reaction that produces the bar of soap sitting in your bathroom right now. The oldest hard evidence we have of intentional soap making comes from the city of Babylon, in what is today the country of Iraq, dating back to around 2,800 years before the Common Era. That is nearly 5,000 years ago. Archaeologists excavating the ancient site uncovered clay cylinders, small palm-sized containers, and inside them was a soap-like residue. Inscribed on the outside of those cylinders were instructions, and those instructions said with wonderful plainness, fats boiled with ashes. That is it. That is the world's first recorded recipe, not for bread, not for medicine, for soap. 5,000 years ago, someone in Mesopotamia thought it was important enough to write down. Now here is the part I find genuinely fascinating, and I want to hear if you agree with me on this. The Babylonians, as best as historians can tell, were not actually using that early soap to wash their bodies. They were using it to clean wool, to prepare textiles, to treat wounds. In other words, the first soap in human history was a practical industrial tool, and the idea of using it on yourself, on your own skin, as part of a daily ritual that came much later, which raises a question I've been turning over ever since I started researching this story. Is cleanliness something we discovered for practical reasons first, or was there always something deeper driving it? I think there was. And here is why. Long before the Babylonians pressed their recipe into clay, long before any civilization built its first wall, human beings were already developing what researchers today call disgust avoidance behavior. Disgust, that sharp instinctive revulsion when you encounter something that smells wrong, looks wrong, feels wrong on your skin, is one of the oldest emotions we carry. Scientists believe it evolved for a very specific purpose to protect us from disease and contamination before we had any concept of what disease and contamination actually were. You do not need to understand bacteria to feel deeply uncomfortable when something foul touches your skin. Your body already knows. It has always known. And early humans acted on that instinct. They moved their waste away from their sleeping areas. They avoided the bodies of the sick. They groomed themselves and each other with a care and consistency that, if you look at it honestly, puts many modern people to shame. The Neanderthals, remember, were not just casually picking at their hair. They had dedicated tools for it. Seashell tweezers, small flint scrapers for removing dead skin. These were not accidental objects. Someone chose to make them. Someone chose to carry them. Hygiene even then was a priority. And then came the Bronze Age, roughly 3,000 to 1,200 years before the Common Era, and something shifted. Because now humanity was not just surviving, it was building, trading, accumulating wealth, creating social hierarchies. And with those hierarchies came something new, cleanliness as a statement. Bronze Age royals, we know from archaeological evidence, were particularly obsessed with grooming. They used pumice stones, pieces of volcanic rock, to polish and scrub their skin. They used sea sponges harvested from the Mediterranean coast as the world's first washcloths. They scented their hair with plant oils. They depilated their bodies using beeswax and primitive tweezers. Why? Because how you looked had begun to say something about who you were. Cleanliness was no longer just about health or comfort, or the deep biological impulse to avoid contamination. It was about power. It was about status. It was about the story your appearance told to everyone around you. Sound familiar? By around 2,500 years before the Common Era, which is roughly the same era, when the ancient Sumerians were writing their own early soap formulas on clay tablets, there is evidence that grooming tools had become valuable enough to be buried alongside the dead. Combs made of bone, razors made of copper, small containers of scented oil. People wanted these things with them in whatever came after life. That is not the behavior of a species that did not care about cleanliness. That is the behavior of a species for whom cleanliness was so fundamental to identity that it was worth carrying into eternity. Now, I want to be honest with you about something, because I think this is where the history gets genuinely complicated. All of what I just described, the Neanderthal tweezers, the Babylonian soap cylinders, the Bronze Age pumice stones, all of it comes from the archaeological record of people who were by any measure wealthy, or at least reasonably comfortable. The tools that survive in the ground are the tools that were made well enough to last. The cosmetics that get excavated are the ones that were stored in quality containers. The bodies that are preserved are mostly the bodies of people with enough status to be buried deliberately. What about everyone else? What about the ordinary labourer, the farmer, the shepherd, walking home at dusk with mud on their hands and no pumice stone in sight? The honest answer is we do not know as much about them. Their tools were probably made of wood and reeds and clay things that decompose. Their habits were not written down. but we can make a reasonable inference, because the impulse to wash, to groom, to remove the day's grime from your skin, that is not something only rich people feel. It never has been. It is something all of us feel. The difference then as now was access, not desire. And that, I think, is the truest and most quietly devastating insight from this earliest chapter of the story. Humanity has always wanted to be clean. Humanity has always tried to be clean. The question that every era has been asking in one way or another is not whether cleanliness matters. The question is always who gets to be clean, and who is left through poverty or circumstance or simple bad luck to do the best they can with what little they have. That question did not begin in the Middle Ages. It did not begin in ancient Babylon. It was there at the very start. And as we move through this story tonight, you're going to see it come up again and again across thousands of years in ways that are sometimes surprising and sometimes deeply uncomfortably familiar. But right now, let us travel forward. From the ash-smeared hands of our earliest ancestors, from the quiet fires of prehistoric campsites, from clay cylinders pressed with the world's first recipes, let us move to a civilization that took everything those early innovators discovered and turned it into something extraordinary. A civilization that was in the truest sense of the word obsessed with cleanliness. A civilization where the priests bathed 4 times every single day, where ordinary people had deodorant and breath mints and skincare rituals so sophisticated they would not look out of place in a modern pharmacy, where the entire philosophy of how you treated your body was wrapped up in questions of the divine, the sacred and the eternal. We are going to ancient Egypt, and I promise you what you are about to hear is not what you were taught in school. Egypt. Just the word itself does something to the imagination, doesn't it? Pyramids rising out of golden sand, the Nile stretching south like a dark ribbon through endless desert, pharaohs wrapped in linen buried with gold surrounded by everything they might need for the journey beyond. We think we know ancient Egypt, but most of us picture it through the lens of Hollywood dramatic shadowy, a little dusty. And here is what that picture almost always leaves out. Ancient Egypt was one of the cleanest civilizations that has ever existed on this planet. Let me put that into perspective. By around 1500 years before the Common Era, which is roughly 3500 years ago, the homes of Egyptian aristocrats were already equipped with copper pipes that carried both hot and cold running water directly into the bathroom. Copper pipes, hot and cold water, inside the house. That is technology that most of Europe would not have again until the 19th century of the Common Era, 3,000 years later. And this was not considered unusual in Egypt. It was expected. It was standard. It was what a comfortable home was supposed to have. But the story of Egyptian cleanliness goes much deeper than plumbing. And honestly, the plumbing is almost the least interesting part. What makes ancient Egypt truly extraordinary is that they did not just practice cleanliness. They built an entire philosophy around it. For the ancient Egyptians, being clean was not separate from being good, or being devout, or being worthy of the afterlife. It was all the same thing. The body was sacred. The body was the vessel that carried the soul through this life and into the next. And if you wanted any chance of making it through to what came after, you had better show up presentable. This was not a metaphor. This was a legal requirement inscribed in the most important religious document the Egyptians ever produced. In the Egyptian Book of the Dead, a collection of sacred spells and instructions that wealthy Egyptians paid to have prepared for their burials, there is a passage known as Spell 125. It describes the moment after death when your soul stands in the hall of truth before the god Osiris. Your heart is placed on one side of a great scale. On the other side rests a feather. If your heart is lighter than the feather, if you lived with honesty and justice, you pass through to paradise. if not a creature called part lion and part crocodile, devours your heart, and you cease to exist entirely. No second chance, no appeal. That is it. Now, the fascinating thing about this spell is not the drama of the weighing. It is what the text says before you can even speak a single word in your defense. The spell specifies that you cannot recite. It cannot present yourself before the gods at all unless you arrive, quote, clean dressed in fresh clothes, shod in white sandals, painted with eye paint, anointed with the finest oil of myrrh. The gods will not even hear you if you show up dirty. Let that sit for a moment. The Egyptians were so committed to cleanliness that they wrote it into the terms and conditions of the afterlife. And the detail about eye paint that is not just cosmetic vanity, by the way. Scientists analysing Egyptian eye cosmetics in the collections of the Louvre Museum in Paris discovered something remarkable. The dark eye paint that Egyptians wore, the famous black coal you see on every ancient portrait, every hieroglyphic figure, was not just decorative. Chemical analysis of those cosmetics revealed that certain compounds in the lead-based mixture actually boosted nitric oxide production in human skin cells by up to 240%. Nitric oxide is a key signaling agent in the immune system. It helps the body fight infection. In a region where the Nile Delta bred mosquitoes, flies, and constant exposure to eye infections, those cosmetics were functioning as a kind of primitive medicine. The Egyptians did not know this. They thought they were honouring the gods, but they were also, without knowing it, protecting themselves. That is the kind of detail that I find genuinely haunting. The gap between what people believed they were doing and what was actually happening in their bodies. Now let us talk about the priests. Because if ordinary Egyptians were remarkably clean, the priests were on an entirely different level. Egyptian priests were required to bathe 4 times every single day, twice during the day and twice at night. Think about your own morning routine. The 10 minutes you spend in the shower half asleep wishing you did not have to get out. Now imagine doing that 4 times every day as a religious obligation, with the understanding that if you approach the gods while unclean, you were committing something close to sacrilege. And the bathing was just the beginning. Priests shave their entire bodies, heads, eyebrows, every hair, every other day. This was not for aesthetic reasons. The ancient historian Herodotus, who travelled through Egypt around 450 years before the Common Era, wrote with obvious fascination about the Egyptian priests, "They are scrupulously clean. They wear linen only freshly washed every day. Every day. Fresh linen every single day." While Greece and Persia were still rewearing the same robes for weeks at a time, Egyptian priests were doing daily laundry as a spiritual practice. The linen detail matters more than it might seem. Linen is a fascinating fabric from a hygiene perspective. It is woven from flax, a plant, and it has a natural property that modern scientists have confirmed. Linen absorbs moisture from the skin exceptionally quickly, and then releases it into the air, keeping the skin drier than almost any other natural fabric. Linen is also naturally antibacterial to a degree. It resists the growth of certain microorganisms. The Egyptians did not know any of this on a scientific level, but they figured it out through observation. They noticed that people who wore linen and changed it regularly were healthier. They noticed that linen left the body feeling cooler and cleaner, and so they made it the fabric of the sacred. Only the purest material for the purest purpose. Now I want to share something with you that I think is genuinely one of the most interesting details in all of ancient history. In the year 2003, a group of dentists gathered at a conference in Vienna, Austria. And at that conference they did something unusual. They reconstructed an ancient Egyptian toothpaste recipe, followed the original instructions as closely as they could, and then they used it. The recipe, which dates back to somewhere around the 4th century of the Common Era, though Egyptian dental care traditions stretch back much further, called for specific quantities of rock salt, dried mint, dried iris flower, and ground pepper combined into a fine powder. The modern dentists who tested this preparation reported that it worked, uncomfortably well in fact. One dentist noted that his gums bled when he used it, which is generally a sign that something is cleaning very effectively, but that his mouth felt cleaner than it did after using modern commercial toothpaste. And there was a much older Egyptian recipe even before that one that listed powdered ox hooves, ash, burnt eggshells, and pumice as its ingredients. Ox hooves, ash, burnt eggshells, put together a mildly abrasive, slightly alkaline powder that would have mechanically removed plaque from tooth surfaces with reasonable effectiveness. 4,000 years ago. And then there is the question of deodorant. Because yes, ancient Egypt had deodorant. Not the spray can version, not the roll-on with aluminum, zirconium and a name that sounds like a car model, but real functional deodorant. Egyptian recipes for what we might call deodorant included mixtures of carob powder, incense and various plant resins rolled into small pellets and placed directly under the arms. Other recipes called for combinations of cinnamon, frankincense, crushed nuts and herbs ground into a paste with fat. The Hearst Papyrus, one of the oldest surviving Egyptian medical texts, contains a specific recipe recommending a mixture of lettuce, myrrh, incense and another plant to be rubbed across the body to prevent the smell of perspiration. And here is the elegant insight the Egyptians had that took the Western world another 3,000 years to formally understand. They noticed that removing underarm hair dramatically reduced body odor. This was not a medical discovery. They had no concept of bacterial metabolism, no understanding that the smell of sweat comes largely from bacteria feeding on secretions in the underarm glands. But they observed the correlation. They shaved, and the smell was less, simple, effective, thousands of years ahead of its time. Of course, all of this, the copper pipes, the eye paint that doubled as medicine, the toothpaste tested by 21st century dentists, the priests bathing before dawn, all of this was experienced very differently depending on where you stood in Egyptian society. The wealthy had private bathrooms with limestone-seated toilets and servants to pour heated water from large jugs over their bodies. They had access to kaifi, the most coveted perfume in the ancient world, a blend of frankincense, myrrh, cinnamon, cardamom, and up to 16 other herbs and spices so rare and expensive it was primarily burned as incense in temples offered only to the gods. The poor bathed in the Nile, which was also, I should note, with some discomfort, where people washed their clothes, and sometimes used as a bathroom, and where crocodiles occasionally waited. An ancient Egyptian poem, one of the earliest pieces of occupational writing ever discovered, describes a laundry worker on the riverbank with one eye always on the water, neighbour to the crocodile as he swims upstream. Sometimes cleanliness really did require genuine courage, but what I keep coming back to when I think about ancient Egypt and hygiene is not the recipes or the rituals or the remarkable technology. It is the philosophy underneath all of it. The Egyptians did not clean their bodies because they were afraid of germs. They did not bathe because a doctor told them to. They cleaned themselves because they believed with complete sincerity that the body was a sacred vessel, that the way you treated your physical form said something about the respect you had for the divine spark inside it. That cleanliness was not separate from spirituality. It was an expression of it. And honestly, I think that is a more beautiful reason to take care of yourself than most of the ones we use today. Now, from the banks of the Nile with its crocodiles and its copper pipes and its priests bathing by starlight, let us cross the Mediterranean. Because there was another civilization rising, one that had been watching Egypt from afar, deeply impressed, taking notes. They took the Egyptian love of oil for the skin. They took the idea that cleanliness was divine. They took the concept of public washing as a social institution, and then they did something entirely their own with it. Something so sophisticated, so philosophical, so deeply woven into the fabric of daily life, that when it was finally lost, when the civilization that built it collapsed, the world would spend centuries mourning what had disappeared. We are going to ancient Greece. And the first thing I need to tell you is that the Greeks invented the shower. Not a metaphorical shower, not a symbolic shower, actual water, actual pipes, flowing over actual human bodies. 300 years before the Common Era, let us go there. Picture this for a moment. You're in the city of Pergamon in what is now Western Turkey, around 300 years before the Common Era. You've just finished 2 hours of wrestling practice at the gymnasium. Your body is covered in sand and olive oil and the sweat of a genuinely vigorous morning. You're tired in that deeply satisfying way that only real physical effort produces. And now you walk to a room at the back of the gymnasium where something remarkable waits. Water cold, clear flowing, pours down over your head through a series of lead pipes mounted above you, routed directly from the city's aqueduct system, through the walls of the building, and out through carved stone spouts shaped like the heads of animals. You stand there. The water runs over your shoulders. The grime of the morning washes away. You just took a shower. In 300 years before the Common Era. That is not a metaphor. That is not an approximation. Archaeologists excavating the ancient site of Pergamon found physical evidence of precisely this setup. The pipes, the drainage channels, the stone spouts along with pottery from the same era, showing images of men standing under flowing water in exactly this way. The ancient Greeks invented the shower, and unlike so many things attributed to the ancient world in popular culture, this one is actually verifiably archaeologically confirmed. Now, I want to spend some time in Greece today, not just because of the shower, which is genuinely remarkable, but because I think the Greeks offer something even more interesting than their technology. They offer a philosophy of cleanliness, and that philosophy, more than any pipe or basin or scraping tool, is what makes ancient Greek hygiene feel startlingly modern. Here is what I mean. The word hygiene, the actual English word you use every time you talk about personal cleanliness, comes from ancient Greek. It derives from Hygeia, the Greek goddess of health, cleanliness, and sanitation. Hygeia was the daughter of Asclepius, the god of medicine, and she was not a minor figure tucked away in some obscure corner of the mythology. She had dedicated temples in Epidaurus in Corinth, in the island of Kos, and in Pergamon. She was depicted holding a serpent, which is still the symbol of medicine today, and a bowl from which the serpent drinks. The bowl and serpent of Hygeia, it is the symbol you see on the sign of virtually every pharmacy in Europe right now. A goddess worshipped over 2,000 years ago. Her symbol still hanging above the place where you pick up your prescriptions. Think about that for a second. But the Greeks were not simply worshipping cleanliness as a divine abstraction. They were building it into the physical and intellectual infrastructure of their civilization. The gymnasium, and I do mean the building, not the modern conception of it, was perhaps the most important institution in a Greek city. The word itself comes from the Greek gymnos, meaning naked, because that is how athletes trained, in the open, in daylight, without clothing. Not from any lack of modesty, but from a deeply held philosophical conviction the human body properly trained and properly cared for was something to be celebrated rather than hidden. And crucially, the gymnasium was not just a place to exercise, it was a place to bathe, to debate, to listen to philosophers lecture, to conduct business, to socialize. Plato himself, the philosopher who gave us the theory of ideal forms, who wrote the Republic, who tutored Alexander the Great's own teacher. Plato reportedly delivered philosophical discussions at the public baths. Imagine walking in for a wash, and finding yourself sitting next to one of the greatest minds in human history, mid-lecture on the nature of virtue. No app required, no ticket purchased, just show up, get clean, and accidentally receive a philosophy education. The cleansing ritual itself, by the way, was something that deserves more attention than it usually gets, because the Greeks did not use soap, not in the way we understand it. What they used instead was a process that, when you think about the chemistry, was actually quite effective. It went like this. First, the athlete or bather would coat their skin with a mixture of fine sand or ash and olive oil. They would rub this paste across the entire body, working it into the skin. The oil trapped dirt, sweat, and impurities, pulled them away from the surface of the skin and suspended them in the oil itself. The sand provided gentle abrasion, lifting dead skin cells. Then came the strigil. The strigil was a curved bronze or iron blade, think of a long comma shape with a handle, and it was used to scrape the entire mixture off the skin in long, firm strokes. Oil, dirt, sweat, dead skin, all of it peeling away in one satisfying motion. Archaeologists have found strigils in graves across Greece, Etruria, and later Rome. Some are plain bronze, some are finely engraved works of art. Some have the owner's name scratched into the handle. One found in an Etruscan woman's tomb was made of silver, inscribed with what appears to be the beginning of her name, a silver strigil, buried with a woman because it was that important to her, because it was that central to how she understood herself and her dignity. These were not merely tools, they were objects of identity. Here is the part of Greek hygiene that I think most people miss entirely, though. And honestly, it changed how I think about the relationship between cleanliness and civilization. The Greeks did not just believe that a clean body was a healthy body. They believed that a clean body was a moral body. This is where it gets philosophically interesting. Plato wrote that the gymnasium was vital not only for training the body, but for refining civic character. That a well-maintained physical form was the outward expression of an inward discipline. More than that, the Greeks believed that showing up to public life, to the assembly, to the temple, to any gathering of citizens with an unwashed body, was a sign of barbarism, not poverty, not misfortune, barbarism. It was a statement about who you were. A sweaty, ungroomed man was saying, however unintentionally, I do not respect this community enough to prepare myself for it. That is a remarkable idea, and it cuts in two directions. On one hand, it meant that Greek culture placed extraordinary value on the effort of self-presentation, on the daily discipline of caring for your body as a form of civic respect. On the other hand, it created a sharp and sometimes cruel boundary between those who could afford the time and tools for proper grooming and those who could not. A slave who never made it to the gymnasium was not unwashed because they lacked character. They were unwashed because they were never given the chance. The philosophy was beautiful. The application of it was in many cases deeply unjust. And that tension between the ideal of cleanliness as civic virtue and the reality of who had access to that virtue is something the Greeks never fully resolved. Neither, honestly, have we. Now let me tell you something about the Greeks and cold water that I think is quietly wonderful. Plato wrote, and this is a real quote paraphrased from his dialogues, that bathing in lukewarm water was suitable only for the elderly and the infirm, the young, the strong, the disciplined cold water. Always cold water. This was not just personal preference, it was philosophy encoded in the temperature. The Spartans famously took cold baths as preparation for war. The shock of cold water on the skin was training. It was practice for discomfort, practice for endurance, practice for the gap between what the body wants and what the will commands it to do. Even today, 2,500 years later, Sports scientists publish papers on the benefits of cold water immersion for athletic recovery. Biohackers and longevity researchers promote cold plunges as a tool for discipline and mental resilience. The Spartans got there first, not with a research study, with a bucket of cold water before dawn and the belief that suffering quietly is a form of excellence. I want to pause here and ask you something if you're still awake. Do you think cleanliness and character are actually connected because the Greeks believed they were? Not as a metaphor, but as a genuine conviction. When I think about my own morning routine, the moments when I skip the shower, because I'm tired when I tell myself it doesn't really matter, I wonder if there is something to the Greek idea that I am quietly talking myself out of. Not the barbarism part, not the judgment of others, but the private relationship between taking care of your own body and taking yourself seriously. Maybe the Greeks were onto something. Maybe the Strigils scraped away more than just oil and sand. There is one more detail about Greek hygiene that I need to share before we move on, and it is something that surprised me deeply when I first encountered it. Outside every major temple in ancient Greece, at Delphi, at Eleusis, at the great sanctuaries across the Aegean world, there were stone basins filled with water. They were called periranteria, and they served a specific purpose before you entered the sacred space, before you addressed the gods. You washed your hands. Not your whole body, your hands. The gesture was both literal and symbolic. You were purifying yourself before approaching the divine. You were acknowledging in the simplest physical way that what you were about to enter was deserving of care and preparation. Now here is what strikes me about this. We still do this. Not in temples necessarily, but every hospital, every clinic, every operating room in the world has a washing station at the entrance. Every kitchen has a rule about washing your hands before you touch food. The ritual is ancient. The science behind it is modern. But the that instinct was standing at the gates of Delphi 3,000 years ago. And so from Greece, from its cold showers and silver strigils and philosophers lecturing at the public baths and stone basins at the temple gates, we arrive at the civilization that took everything Greece built and expanded it to a scale that still defies the imagination. Rome. If the Greeks gave cleanliness a philosophy, the Romans gave it an empire. They took the gymnasium bath and built something so large, so magnificent, so thoroughly woven into the fabric of daily Roman life, that the ruins of these buildings still stop people in their tracks 2,000 years later. They took the Greek aqueduct and turned it into one of the greatest engineering achievements in human history, a system of pipes and tunnels and bridges that delivered clean water to millions of people every single day. And the average Roman citizen, not the emperor, not the senator, not the wealthy merchant, the ordinary person who worked in a market stall or repaired sandals or carried bricks on a construction site, that ordinary person used more fresh water in a single day than many households in the modern developing world use in a week. That is the scale we're talking about. Let us go to Rome. Rome. Let's just sit with that word for a moment. Not the tourist destination, not the city of gelato and cobblestones and selfies at the Trevi Fountain, though I say that with genuine affection. The Rome I want you to picture is the Rome of the 2nd and 3rd centuries of the Common Era, a city of 1 billion people, arguably the most complex human settlement that had ever existed on this planet, a place where bread was delivered, where gladiatorial combat was entertainment, where philosophy was debated in public squares, and where, and this is the part that still astonishes me every time I revisit the numbers, every single resident of that city had access to more than 1,000 litres of fresh, clean water. Every day, per person, 1,000 litres. To give you a sense of scale, the average American household today uses roughly 375 litres per person per day. Ancient Rome was giving every citizen, not every wealthy household, every citizen nearly 3 times that amount. And the Rome I just described did not have electric pumps, did not have plastic pipes, did not have any of the technology we associate with modern water systems. They had math, they had stone, they had volcanic cement that has outlasted almost every building material humanity has invented since, and they had 11 aqueducts stretching as far as 90 kilometers from the city, carrying water through tunnels bored into mountains and across valleys, on arched stone bridges with an almost incomprehensible precision, some maintaining a gradient of just over 1 centimeter of downward slope per meter across their entire length. 1 centimeter per meter for 90 kilometers. Calculated by hand, cut in stone. I want you to really let that sink in. Now, where did all that water go? Drinking, of course. Fountains, approximately 1,200 of them, scattered across the city so that no neighborhood was more than a short walk from fresh running water. But mostly it went to the baths. 900 bathhouses, according to historical records operating in Rome alone by the height of the empire. 900. Everything from small neighborhood establishments to institutions so vast and so magnificent that they still leave modern visitors speechless in their ruins 1,800 years after they were built. The Baths of Caracalla, built between the years 212 and 235 of the Common Era, during the reign of the emperor whose nickname Caracalla came from his fondness for a particular style of cloak. This was not a man remembered for gentleness. He murdered his own brother, his own wife, reportedly ordered the killing of thousands of people on a single day in Alexandria, but his baths were magnificent. The complex covered approximately 27 acres. Just the main building was 40 meters tall, roughly the height of a 12-story modern office building. Inside, an Olympic-sized swimming pool open to the sky. A circular hot room whose ceiling reached the same height as the Pantheon dome and featured enormous glass windows specifically angled to capture the heat of the afternoon sun. 2 libraries, one in Latin, one in Greek, gymnasiums, saunas, massage rooms, gardens, a waterfall inside the building, and 7 separate pools of heated water in the hot room alone, each one large enough for multiple bathers at once. The floors were covered in mosaics. The walls were lined with 6,300 cubic meters of imported marble and Egyptian granite. The ceilings were glass mosaic that caught the light from the pools and scattered it in shifting iridescent patterns across the walls. This building received up to 8,000 visitors every single day, and it ran on 21 million gallons of water daily, delivered by its own dedicated aqueduct built specifically and solely to supply these baths, not shared with the rest of the city, its own aqueduct, just for one set of baths. Now I need to tell you something about the Roman baths that I think changes how you see them entirely. Because when most people imagine the Roman baths, they picture something like a luxurious spa, wealthy Romans reclining in perfumed water, slaves attending to their every need. And yes, some of that is accurate, especially in private bath facilities. But the great public thermae, the baths of Caracalla, the baths of Diocletian, the baths of Agrippa, these were not luxury facilities. They were public infrastructure. By the 3rd century, only about 1.5% of Romans were wealthy enough to have private plumbing in their homes. The rest of the city, the merchants, the craftspeople, the day labourers, the freedmen, the slaves who'd been given their freedom and were trying to build a life, they all bathed here, together, at prices so low they were effectively free for the poor. Some historians believe many of the great thermae charged no admission at all, their costs absorbed by emperors who understood with the sharp political instinct that the best of them possessed that a clean, comfortable population was less likely to revolt. You want to win the affection of 1 million people in the ancient world, build them the most spectacular spectacular public bath in history. Make it free, and fill it with art. Caracalla, for all his cruelty, understood this perfectly. Here is what a typical Roman bath visit looked like for an ordinary citizen. You arrive in the late afternoon. Romans typically bathed before the main meal of the day, which came in the early evening. You strip and leave your clothes in a changing room where you might hire a slave or attendant to watch over them. Theft was apparently a real concern. Several ancient Roman writers mention it with the resigned familiarity of someone describing modern airport security. You begin in the gymnasium exercise first, running, wrestling, ball games, whatever your preference. Then you progress through the sequence of rooms that is the essential architecture of every Roman bath: the tepidarium, a warm room to begin opening the pores; the caldarium, the hot room where steam and heat do their work; and finally, for the brave and the disciplined, the frigidarium, the cold room with its plunge pools of unheated water. At each stage oil is applied and scraped off with a strigil, exactly as in Greece, though many Romans also had access to soap by this era, borrowed from the Gauls that Romans initially regarded with mild suspicion, before adopting it enthusiastically. And throughout all of this you are not alone and you're not quiet. Vendors walk through the halls selling snacks and drinks. Musicians play somewhere nearby. Philosophers and lawyers conduct meetings. Business deals are negotiated. Gossip is exchanged. Political alliances are formed. The Roman writer Seneca, who lived above a bathhouse and complained bitterly about the noise, described hearing the grunting of weightlifters, the splashing of swimmers, the arguments of men who enjoyed causing trouble, the shouts of vendors, and the cheerful singing of men who apparently believed the acoustics of a marble bath made them sound better than they were. He was writing a letter of complaint, but reading it 2,000 years later, I find it one of the most vivid portraits of ordinary human life ever recorded. These were not solemn temples of hygiene. They were alive. They were messy. They were everything a city is when its people gather in one place without pretense or ceremony. There is one aspect of Roman bath culture, though, that I feel I have to address honestly, because it complicates the picture considerably. The water in those beautiful pools was not changed as often as you might hope. Romans had no concept of waterborne pathogens. They did not know about bacteria. They did not know that the warm, cloudy water of a caldarium pool used by hundreds of people every day, without filtration or regular replacement, was potentially a remarkable incubator for disease. Scholars have debated for years whether the Roman baths were actually sanitary in the modern sense. The short answer is, for scrubbing the body of visible dirt, oil and sweat, yes, quite effective. For actual pathogen elimination, less so. The Greek physician Galen, who was one of the most influential medical writers of the Roman era, recommended bathing for health, but also noted that bath water sitting too long became problematic. An archaeological analysis of latrine deposits near Roman baths has revealed a somewhat uncomfortable quantity of intestinal parasites, so the Romans were extraordinarily clean by the standards of their world. They were also unknowingly sharing microorganisms in ways that their understanding of medicine simply could not prepare them for, which is not a criticism of them. It is a reminder of how much knowledge matters, and how much we do not always know we do not know. But here is what I keep returning to when I think about Roman bath culture. The thing that feels most profound to me, it is not the engineering. Though the engineering is breathtaking, it is not the scale. Though the scale is almost incomprehensible, it is the democracy of it. The baths of Caracalla were the same for everyone who walked through those 4 entrances. The slave who had saved enough to pay the small admission, the merchant, the senator, the same marble floor, the same glass ceiling scattering light over the water, the same steam rising in the caldarium, the same cold plunge waiting for those brave enough to take it. For a few hours every afternoon in a society built on rigid hierarchies of class and status and citizenship, the baths were a place where the body was the only credential that mattered. Everyone inside these walls was equally wet, equally naked, equally human. I find something genuinely moving in that. And then, in the year 476 of the Common Era, the Western Roman Empire fell. The Germanic tribes who'd been pressing at the borders for generations finally overwhelmed what remained of the empire's defences. Rome was sacked. The political structure collapsed, and one by one the invaders did something that ended up being far more consequential than any battle. They cut the aqueducts, not out of malice necessarily. Strategic disruption mostly. If you deny a city its water supply, the city cannot function. And Rome went within a generation from supplying 1 million people with 1,000 litres of water per person per day to relying on the Tiber River and whatever wells could be dug. The population of Rome collapsed from 1 million to somewhere around 30,000 in the decades that followed. Not 30,000 with baths. 30,000 period. The great baths of Caracalla, which had served 8,000 visitors daily for over 300 years, went silent in the year 537 when the Ostrogoths destroyed the final aqueduct feeding them. That was the end. Not of the building still stands. Its walls still rise 30 metres into the Roman sky. Its mosaics are in the Vatican museums. Its granite tubs are being used as fountains in a piazza a few miles away. But the water stopped flowing, and with it something was lost that Europe would not recover for over 1,000 years. Which brings us to the question that has been quietly waiting at the edge of this story since we began. If Rome had all of this, the engineering, the philosophy, the infrastructure, the cultural commitment to cleanliness, what happened in the centuries that followed? How did Europe go from 900 bathhouses and 1,000 litres per person per day to a continent where even monarchs rarely bathed? The answer involves plague-fair religion and one of the most fascinating and misunderstood chapters in all of human history. People did not simply forget how to be clean when Rome fell. Something far more specific happened. Something that began with a genuine public health crisis got tangled up in theology and ended with Europeans genuinely rationally terrified of water. That story starts right after this. Alright, let's clear something up right away, because we ended part 5 with me promising you the story of how Europe went from 900 Roman bathhouses to a continent where water was feared, and I meant every word of that. But before we get to the fear, before we get to the plague and the theology, and the genuine rational terror that turned bathing into something dangerous, I need to give you the first half of the medieval story. The half that almost nobody tells. Because here is the truth that gets buried every time someone makes a dirty Middle Ages joke. For the first 400 years after Rome fell, much of Europe kept bathing, kept building bathhouses, kept washing, not with Roman aqueducts, those were gone, not with 1,000 litres per person per day, that luxury had vanished, but with rivers, with wells, with wooden tubs dragged in front of the fire, with public bathhouses connected to local bakeries to share the heat. The bathing culture did not end with Rome, it survived, it adapted, and for a few remarkable centuries it actually thrived. Let me take you to Paris in the year 1290 of the Common Era. Paris is a city of roughly 200,000 people. The streets are narrow and frequently unpleasant, I will not pretend otherwise. Animals wander. Waste is disposed of in ways that would make a modern city inspector faint. But in that city operating legally under regulation from the local authorities, there are 32 public bathhouses. 32, and in the early mornings, according to a writer named Alexander Neckham, who lived in Paris around a century before the city woke to a particular sound, Street vendors outside the bathhouses calling out across the narrow streets, "The baths are hot, the baths are hot." Think about that as an alarm clock, not a phone buzzing on a nightstand. A human voice echoing off stone announcing that the water is warm and the doors are open, come and get clean. The medieval bathhouse was an institution unto itself, and it was nothing like the sombre clinical facility the word bathhouse might conjure in your mind. It was by most contemporary accounts extraordinarily lively. Imagine a long room with a row of wooden tubs, each one large enough for 2 or 3 people. Planks laid across the tubs served as tables. Food was ordered and brought to bathers while they soaked. Barbers worked in adjacent rooms. Simple medical treatments were available, wound dressing, bloodletting, for those who believed in it, pulling of aching teeth. Yes, all of that happened in the bathhouse. German historical etchings from the 15th century show bathhouses where couples are eating full meals together naked in their tubs, with musicians playing nearby and other guests visible in the background smiling over their wine. A historian writing about medieval bath culture described it as the 15th century equivalent of going out to a restaurant. A completely ordinary social occasion. The town of Krakow had 12 public bathhouses. Suffolk, just across the Thames from London, had 18. And Nuremberg, arguably the most hygienically conscious town in medieval Europe, known for its enlightened city council, maintained 14. In some towns, the civic authorities were so serious about cleanliness that they imposed fines on residents who failed to visit a public bath at least once a week. A fine for not bathing. Take that image and sit with it for a moment the next time someone tells you the Middle Ages were all unwashed peasants. Now, the medieval church and the bathhouse had a genuinely complicated relationship. And this is the part where I want to be precise, because the popular understanding of it is almost entirely backwards. People say the church banned bathing. The church discouraged nakedness and communal bathing as sources of moral temptation. And both of those things contain a grain of truth. But the actual picture is far more nuanced. Many monasteries had their own bathhouses. Cluny Abbey in France, for instance, had a bathhouse equipped with 12 tubs. The monks had towels changed twice a week. Washing hands before and after meals was a non-negotiable part of monastic life. The church's objection was not to cleanliness. It was to the specific social environment of the public bathhouse, where men and women bathed together openly, where wine flowed, where business of various kinds was conducted that went well beyond hygiene. Some medieval bathhouses had by the later period acquired a reputation so thoroughly connected to prostitution that the brothels of Suffolk were literally nicknamed the stews, which was the medieval English word for a heated bath. So when certain church authorities warned against bathhouses, they were not warning against cleanliness. They were warning against what happened alongside the cleanliness, a subtle but important distinction. Here is the part of medieval hygiene that I find genuinely surprising, and that I think reveals something wonderful about human creativity under constraint. Linen. If the ancient Romans had water, the medieval Europeans had linen, and they understood how to use it with the sophistication that modern people rarely appreciate. Linen is a fabric made from flax. It is naturally antibacterial to a degree. It absorbs moisture from the skin extremely efficiently, and releases it quickly, keeping the skin drier than wool or other fabrics. And medieval people, particularly the wealthy, knew this. They wore linen undergarments, a shirt or a shift directly against the skin. They changed those undergarments frequently, and they understood without any knowledge of bacteria or skin microbiome science that regularly changing clean linen against the skin kept a person meaningfully cleaner than infrequent bathing in a communal wooden tub. The medieval equivalent of the personal care routine was daily wash of the face hands, and what period texts rather charmingly call the shameful parts, change of linen regularly, and a trip to the public bath as often as circumstances allowed, which for many townspeople meant weekly. Is that less than a daily shower? Of course it is. But it was a genuine, thoughtful, well-reasoned hygiene strategy built around the tools they actually had. And then something happened. Something so catastrophic, so incomprehensible, so sudden and absolute in its destruction, that it changed not just how Europeans felt about bathing, it changed how they felt about being alive. The year is 1347. A Genoese trading ship enters the harbour at Messina in Sicily, after a voyage from the Black Sea ports of the Crimean Peninsula. Most of the sailors are already dead. Those still alive are covered in black oozing swellings, bleeding from multiple parts of their bodies, delirious with fever. The harbour authorities took one look at this ship and ordered it out of the port immediately. It was too late. Within weeks, Sicily was burning. Within months, Italy was engulfed. By the following year, the plague had crossed the Alps. By 1349, it had reached England, Scandinavia, Poland. The Black Death bubonic plague carried in the fleas of rats that rode every ship and every cart and every bundle of traded goods across Europe, killed somewhere between 30 and 50% of the entire European population in less than 5 years. 50 million people by some estimates, dead in 5 years. Now, I want you to try to imagine what that experience did to the human mind, not the statistics, not the number. Imagine living in a village of 200 people, and in the space of 1 year 100 of them are gone. Your neighbours, your children, your parents, your priest. One writer in Florence described looking out over his city and seeing the streets full of dogs dragging abandoned corpses because there was nobody left to bury them. And here is the critical question that would have consumed every surviving mind: why? Because they did not know about bacteria. They did not know about fleas or rats. They did not know that the disease was being carried on the roads by traders and soldiers and pilgrims moving in exactly the same patterns that commerce and religion had always followed. What they knew was the miasma theory, the ancient medical idea dating back to Hippocrates, kept alive by Galen, accepted by virtually every European doctor of the 14th century, that disease was carried in bad air, corrupt air, foul emanations rising from rotting matter, from standing water, from filth. Disease came in through the pores of the skin when the body was exposed to this miasma, and what opens the pores of the skin most effectively? Hot water, steam, exactly what happened in a bathhouse. This was not superstition. This was the best science available applied rationally and consistently to a terrifying situation. The conclusion was logical and absolutely devastating. The bathhouse is killing us. The Dutch philosopher Erasmus, writing in the year 1526, left behind one of the most poignant sentences in the history of hygiene. 25 years ago, he wrote, "Nothing was more fashionable in Brabant than the public baths. Today there are none. The new plague has taught us to avoid them. In a single generation, the entire tradition of public bathing, 32 bathhouses in Paris, 18 in Suffolk, 12 in Krakow, the weekly ritual that had survived the fall of Rome, that had persisted through centuries of struggle and poverty and plague, gone. Not because people stopped caring about cleanliness, because they were terrified, because they had watched half the people they loved die. And they had heard the explanation that made complete sense given everything they knew. The water opens your pores, the miasma enters. The disease takes hold. Do not bathe, do not open your skin to the poisoned air. Now, what replaced bathing? This is where it gets genuinely strange. If you cannot wash your body with water because water is dangerous, you have to find another way to manage the body's surface. And two things filled that void. The first was linen, doubled down on, tripled down on. If clean linen against the skin was already a good strategy in the early Middle Ages, it now became almost the entire strategy for cleanliness. change your linen shirt, change it again. The visible whiteness of your linen collar and cuffs became the primary signal to yourself to others that you were a clean person. A white collar was not just a fashion statement in this era. It was a declaration of personal hygiene. The second replacement was perfume, not to smell pleasant, to survive. If miasma bad air was the carrier of disease, then good air was your protection. Flowers and herbs held near the nose, pomanders, small spherical containers of aromatic spices worn around the neck or carried in the hand. Strong scents burned in sick rooms and public spaces. A physician entering a plague house would hold a bundle of rosemary and cloves to his face. Not because he liked the smell, because he genuinely believed it was keeping him alive. And this, more than anything else, is the origin of the image we carry of the unwashed Middle Ages. Not 1,000 years of people who did not care, but a specific datable moment when rational human beings looked at the evidence available to them, drew a logical conclusion, and made a terrible mistake. The mistake was not stupidity. The mistake was incomplete knowledge. They knew disease was spreading. They did not know how. They built a theory that fit the facts they had. The theory was wrong, and the cost of that wrongness was borne by every generation that came after in habits that calcified into culture, in fears that were passed from parent to child, in the growing conviction across 2 centuries that water itself was something to be wary of. By the time those habits could have been questioned, they had become invisible, just the way things were. I want to ask you something. If you had watched half your community die and the most educated people around you had explained with complete sincerity and reasoned argument that the source of the danger was hot water and open pores, would you have believed them? I think most of us would. Because we want explanations for catastrophe. We need them, and we reach for the best ones we have. This is one of the most fundamentally human things about the history of hygiene. It is not a story about ignorance or carelessness. It is a story about people doing the best they could with what they knew, and sometimes the best you can do leads you somewhere very, very wrong. But here is something remarkable. While Europe was retreating from water in the centuries after the Black Death, while bathhouses were closing, and linen was becoming the hygiene currency of the continent, there was a civilization not far away that never stopped, that built its hygiene culture into the architecture of its cities, into the law of its religion, into the daily rhythm of its people's lives, in a way that the plague could not touch, and the miasma theory could not explain away. While Europe was afraid of water, they were building tens of thousands of places to use it. We're going there next. There is a moment in history I keep returning to, and I want to share it with you. The year is somewhere around 1096 of the Common Era. The armies of the First Crusade have just arrived in the Holy Land. They have marched for months across Europe and through the mountains of Anatolia. They have fought battles. They have survived hardship. They are the military vanguard of Western Christendom arriving to reclaim Jerusalem. And according to multiple accounts from Arab chroniclers who observed these men, the first thing the local population noticed about them was not their weapons, not their armor, not even their religious fervor. It was their smell. One medieval historian recorded that crusading knights would boast openly with apparent pride of having bathed no more than 4 times in the past year. 4 times in a year. To a population where public washing before prayer was not a luxury or a courtesy, but a religious obligation performed 5 times every single day, this was not merely unpleasant. It was almost incomprehensible. A Syrian nobleman named Usama ibn Munki, who encountered crusaders both in battle and in diplomatic settings, left behind a memoir called The Book of Instruction, one of the most fascinating first-hand accounts of cultural collision in all of medieval history. Reading it today, you can almost feel his mixture of genuine curiosity and barely contained bewilderment at the hygiene habits of his European guests. So what was happening exactly on the other side of the Mediterranean while Europe was retreating from water? The short answer is the exact opposite. The Islamic world was building. Let me set the scene properly, because the contrast deserves to be felt rather than just described. In the 10th century of the Common Era, Baghdad was arguably the greatest city in the world. Its population may have reached 1 million, comparable to Rome at its peak, and it was the administrative, intellectual and commercial heart of the Abbasid Caliphate. A scholar and court official named Hilal al-Sabi, who lived from 969 to 1056, estimated that Baghdad at its height contained 60,000 hammams. 60,000. Now al-Sabi was almost certainly exaggerating. Historians who study this period accept that freely. But even the exaggeration tells you something essential. This was a man trying to convey magnitude, trying to make a reader understand how thoroughly, how comprehensively, how completely central the public bath was to life in his city. You did not describe a great city in the medieval Islamic world by counting its markets or its palaces or its armies. You counted its hammams. The scholar and historian writing about the city of Aleppo recorded that before the Mongol invasion of the 13th century destroyed much of the city's infrastructure, Aleppo was home to 177 hammams. 177 in a single city. But to understand why, you have to understand something deeper than architecture, something that goes to the very foundation of Islamic thought. In the Hadith, the collected sayings and practices of the Prophet Muhammad, there is a phrase that became one of the most famous in all of Islamic tradition: cleanliness is half of faith. This was not a recommendation. It was not a nice to have. It was a theological statement about the relationship between the body and the soul. In Islamic jurisprudence, physical purity and spiritual purity were not separate categories. They were aspects of the same thing. You could not pray in a state of ritual impurity. You could not touch the sacred text without first purifying yourself. You could not present yourself before God with an unwashed body. The two primary rituals of Islamic purification are called wudu and ghusl. Wudu partial ablution is performed before each of the 5 daily prayers. It involves washing the face, the hands and arms to the elbow, passing wet hands over the head, and washing the feet to the ankle. 5 times every day. Every day. Ghusl full body purification is required in specific circumstances after certain intimate acts, after menstruation, after childbirth. It involves washing the entire body with clean water, and the hammam, the public bathhouse, was the institution that made both of these obligations possible for people who had no private bathrooms. Most hammams in the medieval Islamic world were built in close physical proximity to mosques, sometimes as part of the same architectural complex, because the hammam and the mosque were understood to serve the same fundamental purpose, preparing the whole human being, body and soul together, to stand before God. Now let me take you inside one, because the Islamic hammam was not simply a functional space. It was a work of architecture, a work of art, and a masterpiece of engineering. You enter through a changing room, cool, quiet, often decorated with geometric tile work. You leave your outer garments here, taking a cloth wrap for modesty inside. Then you move inward through a series of rooms of ascending heat and humidity. The first room is warm, the second is hotter, the third the harara. The heat room is the innermost and hottest space, centered on a large raised marble platform called the navel stone or gobek tasha, heated from below by a hypercourse system of hot air channels running under the floor. You lie on this stone. The warmth rises through the marble into your back. Steam fills the air. A professional attendant, sometimes called a telek in the Turkish tradition, works on your body with a rough woven mitt called a kizi, scrubbing away dead skin cells that have loosened in the heat. Then a soap massage. Traditional hammam soap, particularly the famous Aleppo soap made from olive oil and laurel berry oil worked into a rich lather. The laurel berry oil, unique to the region around Aleppo, has natural antifungal and antibacterial properties that were simply not understood in scientific terms, but were noticed and valued in practice. Then cool water poured over the body to close the pores. Then the changing room again. Tea perhaps. Rest. The whole experience took anywhere from an hour to several hours. And for many people in the medieval Islamic world, it happened at least once a week, with many wealthier citizens going far more frequently. The hammam also served functions that go well beyond hygiene, and I think this is one of the most beautiful aspects of the institution. It was a space of social levelling. When you removed your outer garments and entered the heat rooms, you removed the visible markers of your social position. The merchant and the craftsman, the scholar and the day labourer inside the hammam, stripped of their robes and their signet rings, they were at least temporarily closer to equal. An early Islamic writer described the ideal city as one that has three things: a mosque, a market, and a hammam. The hammam ranked alongside worship and commerce as a pillar of civilized life. Not an amenity, a necessity, as fundamental to a city's identity as a place of prayer. Women had their own separate hammams or separate hours at shared facilities, and those spaces served as something the Islamic world often did not otherwise provide: genuinely private social spaces for women to gather, talk, build relationships, conduct business. Historical accounts describe hammams as the most important social institution in many women's lives. Places where marriages were arranged, where community conflicts were resolved, where new brides were prepared for their wedding day, where women of different social classes could meet on something closer to equal terms. There is one more thing about Islamic hygiene culture that I want to make sure we cover, because it distinguishes this civilization from everything we have talked about so far. The Islamic world understood the connection between cleanliness and public health in a way that was architecturally encoded into its cities. Medieval Islamic cities had systems of water pipes delivering water to neighborhoods. They had designated waste disposal areas separate from food preparation and water sources. They had inspectors called mutasibs who were authorized to enter bathhouses and check the quality of the water, the cleanliness of the surfaces, and the behavior of the attendants. The mutasib could close a hammam that failed to meet standards. He could fine an operator whose water was too dirty or whose facilities were too contaminated. In an era before germ theory, before any scientific understanding of how disease actually spread, the Islamic world had built an administrative system for public health inspection. Not perfectly, of course, not without failures, not without its own blind spots and limitations, but the instinct, the deeply held conviction that cleanliness was not a private matter, but a community responsibility, that the state had an obligation to protect the purity of public water. That instinct ran so deep it was written into law. And here is the contrast that I keep finding quietly devastating. While Erasmus was writing in 1526 that there were no public baths left in Brabant, because the plague had taught Europeans to fear them, at that exact moment in Istanbul, the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent, who would later be called the Lawgiver, was commissioning a new hammam from his court architect Mimar Sinan. Sinan designed the Sembelitas hammam in Istanbul, completed later in the 16th century, with double domes, geometric light patterns falling through star-shaped apertures in the ceiling. A central marble platform so perfectly proportioned that architects still study it today. It is still operating, not as a museum, not as a historic site, as a working hammam. You can walk in today and lie on the same marble stone that has been warmed by the same underground fire system for more than 400 years. I want to sit with that for a moment, because I think it tells us something profound about the relationship between culture, faith, and practice. The Islamic tradition of cleanliness did not survive because it was merely practical. If it had only been practical, the 14th century plague might have disrupted it the same way it disrupted European bath culture. It survived because it was sacred. When your daily hygiene is woven into the fabric of your faith, when washing your hands and face and feet is not just what you do, but part of who you are in relationship to the divine, it becomes almost impossible to simply stop. Fear of miasma cannot override an obligation that runs as deep as prayer. That is not a criticism of Europe, or a celebration of one tradition at the expense of another. It is simply an observation about what happens when hygiene is a cultural value versus when it is an infrastructural convenience. When the infrastructure collapsed, when the aqueducts were cut, when the plague arrived, when the bathhouses closed, European hygiene had nothing beneath it to hold it in place. The Islamic world had 5 daily prayers. Now, while all of this was unfolding, while Europe was navigating its complicated relationship with water, and while the hammam was flourishing from Morocco to Persia, there was an entirely separate chapter of this story playing out in the royal courts of Europe. A chapter that involved some of the most powerful people who ever lived: kings, queens, emperors, and the genuinely astonishing, sometimes faintly horrifying reality of what personal hygiene looked like at the very top of European society. Because here is the thing about royal hygiene that nobody tells you at the beginning. The problem was never entirely a lack of access. Sometimes bewilderingly it was a matter of choice. Let's go there next. Right so. We've talked about the great civilizations that built their hygiene into stone and law and faith. We have talked about the plague years that turned water into something feared. We have talked about the Islamic hammam that held the tradition alive while Europe retreated. Now I want to take you somewhere a little closer to what most of us instinctively imagine when we picture the pre-modern world. Not the ordinary citizen doing their reasonable best. Not the thoughtful monk with his linen and his basin. I want to take you to the palaces, to the kings and queens, the most powerful human beings alive in their respective eras, the people who, by every measure of wealth and access and privilege, could have bathed daily if they had chosen to. And I want to show you what they actually did. Because the royal hygiene story, the real one, not the polished version, is one of the most fascinating, most contradictory, and honestly, most human stories in all of history. Let's start in the most theatrical court in the history of Europe, the Palace of Versailles, France, in the second half of the 17th century. More than 5,000 people living and working within a single building complex, the absolute centre of European political power, the place where fashion was invented, where art was defined, where every court in Europe looked for its cues on how to behave, what to wear, and how to be. And it smelled absolutely dreadful. I want to be careful here because the reputation of Versailles has been somewhat exaggerated over the centuries, often by people with political reasons to make the old monarchy look as decadent and ridiculous as possible. The palace did have running water. It did have more than 30 cesspits beneath its foundations. Louis XIV did commission private latrines. His successor eventually installed one of the first flushing water closets in France in the year 1738. So it was not a complete catastrophe of sanitation by the standards of its era. But it was still by any reasonable modern accounting a place of remarkable and sometimes overwhelming smell. A visitor in the 18th century left behind a description so vivid it almost qualifies as literature. The unpleasant odours in the park, the gardens, even the chateau itself make one's gorge rise. The communicating passages, courtyards, corridors full of urine and waste. A pork butcher actually slaughters and roasts pigs at the bottom of the minister's wing every morning. Every morning, roasting pigs at the base of one of the most magnificent buildings in the world. And at the centre of all of this, in his gilded apartments in the Hall of Mirrors wing, lived Louis XIV himself, the Sun King. 72 years on the throne, the longest reign in European royal history. The man who said, L'état c'est moi, I am the state. The man who turned every aspect of his personal life into a performance of power, his waking, his dressing, his eating, his sleeping, all conducted in public before an audience of courtiers whose entire careers depended on being present for these rituals. And the man who, according to multiple historical sources, bathed at most 2 or 3 times in his entire life. 2 or 3 times in a life of 76 years. Now I need to do something here that I always try to do in this series. I need to be fair to him. Because if you only hear Louis XIV bathed 3 times in his life, you might picture someone who simply did not care about cleanliness. That is not quite right. Louis was in his own way meticulously attentive to his presentation. He changed his shirt multiple times every single day, sometimes 3 times before noon. He washed his hands every morning. He had his body wiped down with alcohol-soaked cloths and perfumed towels. He commissioned his personal perfumer, a man named Marshall, to create a brand new scent for every day of the week, 7 custom fragrances rotating through the 7 days. He had nearly 2,000 crates of orange trees growing in the Versailles orangery, primarily so that the scent of orange blossom could fill certain parts of the palace. When Louis moved through his court, the air moved with him, not with sweat. With jasmine and civet and nutmeg and cloves and benzoin, the raw materials of the most expensive perfumery in Europe. The French court became so known for its fragrance that it earned a specific nickname that persisted for generations, la cour parfumée, the perfumed court. So what was happening here? The answer is the miasma theory pushed to its logical extreme. If water opened the pores and invited disease in, then the correct response was to seal the pores instead, to protect the body surface with oil and alcohol and fragrance, to create a barrier between the skin and the corrupt air that carried illness. Louis XIV was not dirty by accident or by laziness. He was dry by conviction. By the best medical understanding of his era, he was doing the right thing. And in a court where the king set the standard for every aspect of civilized life, his aversion to water cascaded outward. If the most powerful man in Europe did not bathe, then bathing was not something refined people did. Bathing became, in a specific but unmistakable sense, déclassé. Here is one of the most startling facts I came across while researching this part of the story. Louis had a mistress named Madame de Montespan, arguably the most powerful woman in France for much of his reign. Beautiful, brilliant, politically formidable. And according to contemporary accounts, she reportedly bathed in water scented with vanilla and doused herself in extraordinary quantities of perfume. Not because she was unusually vain, but because she reportedly could not bear the smell of her own royal lover. Louis's allergy to bathing had produced consequences that even the most elaborate perfumery could not entirely solve. Now, while we're visiting royal hygiene habits, I want to make a brief stop in Spain, because there is a story about Queen Isabella of Castile that you have probably heard, and I need to tell you the complicated truth about it. The story goes that Isabella, the same Isabella who funded Christopher Columbus's voyages, who unified Spain with her husband Ferdinand of Aragon, one of the most consequential monarchs in European history, bragged that she had bathed only twice in her life, once on the day she was born, once on the day she was married. Now, historians who have looked closely at this claim are skeptical. The sources are often unreliable or filtered through later writers with their own agendas. But here is the uncomfortable truth, even if the specific numbers are exaggerated or invented. The cultural attitude behind them was absolutely real. There exists a genuine historical record of Isabella expressing something close to pride at not having bathed, framing it as an act of ascetic piety rather than neglect. And Ferdinand of Aragon's ambassadors, on encountering the Islamic population of the cities of Granada and Andalusia after the Reconquista, documented with something between fascination and dismay, the daily bathing rituals they observed, the hammams, the ritual washing, the careful attention to bodily purity. Isabella's own court reportedly responded to these Islamic hygiene practices with suspicion. A population that bathed regularly was a population that had not fully abandoned its old ways. Cleanliness became, in this specific and disturbing context, a religious and political marker, not a virtue but a warning sign. The contrast with the Japanese imperial court at roughly the same historical moment is almost too sharp to be comfortable. While Versailles was perfuming itself against its own aversion to water, and while Spanish monarchs were treating bathing as a sign of suspect faith in Japan, bathing had been woven into daily life for centuries with an unbroken continuity that the plague and the miasma theory and the political upheavals of the 16th and 17th centuries simply never disrupted. The Japanese tradition of the ofuro, the deep wooden soaking tub, had roots in Buddhist purification practices going back over 1,000 years. The concept of sento, or public baths, was documented in Japan as early as the 8th century of the Common Era. By the period known as the Edo period, which began in the year 1603, the city of Edo, what we now call Tokyo, had public bathhouses scattered across virtually every district of the city. Daily bathing was not an aspiration or a luxury in Edo. It was simply what people did at the end of the working day. The same era during which French courtiers were strategically placing pomanders near their faces was an era in which Japanese commoners were soaking in communal hot water every single evening. Not the same world, not the same assumptions, not the same answers to the same fundamental question. I want to ask you something. If you had been born into the French court of the 17th century surrounded by the same information, the same medical theories, the same cultural pressures, do you think you would have bathed more than your king? I genuinely do not know the answer for myself. Social pressure is extraordinary. The consensus of your entire civilization is an almost irresistible force. And yet, there were people in 17th century Europe who pushed back. Not many, but some. Benjamin Franklin, who spent years as a diplomat in Paris, reportedly loved his weekly baths so thoroughly that he described them with an enthusiasm his correspondents found slightly alarming. He took what he called air baths, sitting naked in front of an open window on cool mornings because he believed fresh air on the skin was genuinely beneficial. In an era when most of his European contemporaries were still treating water with suspicion, Franklin was essentially running his own one-man hygiene experiment, and he was 80 years old and famously vigorous while doing it. But the larger story of royal hygiene reveals something that I think is genuinely worth sitting with. Wealth and power do not automatically produce better hygiene. Access to water does not automatically mean using it. What determines hygiene more than anything is culture, is belief, is the accumulated invisible weight of what everyone around you considers normal. Louis XIV had running water in his palace. He had servants who could have drawn him a warm bath every morning of his life. He had every practical resource the era could provide, and he did not use them, because the culture he inhabited said not to. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, a city craftsman with no running water, no private plumbing, no technology more sophisticated than a wood-fired boiler and a cedar tub was cleaner by every meaningful measure than the most powerful monarch in Europe. That is not a judgment. It is one of the most quietly fascinating facts about being human. We do not simply act on what we know. We act on what everyone around us acts on. We inherit our habits along with our language and our food and our furniture. And sometimes those inherited habits are glorious, and sometimes they are 3 baths in a lifetime, and sometimes it takes something genuinely radical, a new science, a catastrophic revelation, a shift in how an entire civilization understands the invisible world to change them. Which brings us to the moment that changed everything. Not a plague this time, not a war, not a king, a pump, a map, and a doctor who was willing to be publicly humiliated in service of the truth. The 19th century, London, a city of 2 million people living above its own sewage, and the beginning of the most profound transformation in the history of human hygiene. Let us go there. London, August the 31st, 1854. A narrow street in Soho, a neighbourhood of crowded tenements, slaughterhouses and animal rendering factories, packed close together in the dense heart of the city. A baby named Francis Lewis has been sick for 4 days. Violent illness with dehydration. Her mother, Sarah, washes the baby's soiled clothing and tips the wash water into the cesspool just outside their front door. Francis Lewis dies on September 2nd. Within 10 days of that tipped bucket of wash water, more than 500 people who live on the same few streets are dead. What happened to Soho in September of 1854 was not the worst cholera outbreak London had ever seen. London had suffered through 4 cholera pandemics over the course of the century. The disease had been killing tens of thousands of people in Europe on and off since 1817. But what happened after the Soho outbreak was different from anything that had come before, because this time a doctor who lived a few blocks away was watching, and he had a theory. John Snow was 39 years old in 1854. A physician who had already made significant contributions to the use of anaesthetics in surgery. A quiet, methodical, slightly obsessive man who had been thinking about cholera for years, and who had already in 1849 published a paper arguing something that most of his colleagues considered frankly eccentric, that cholera was not spread through bad air, that it was spread through contaminated water. The paper had been largely ignored. The medical establishment of Victorian London was committed to the miasma theory, the same idea that has been discrediting water for 2 centuries. The General Board of Health itself operated on the principle that disease arose from foul smells. Their solution to cholera was to smell better. Snow's solution was to drink cleaner water. When the Soho outbreak began, Snow went to work. He went door to door on the streets around Broad Street. He knocked on every door he could. He talked to survivors. He gathered addresses. He collected the information that nobody else had thought to collect. Where did you get your drinking water? And he plotted the answers on a map. The result was one of the most important documents in the history of public health. Because when you looked at that map, when you saw the cases of cholera represented as black bars stacked against the addresses of the dead, a pattern emerged that was almost impossible to argue with. The deaths clustered around a single point, a public water pump on Broad Street. Cases dropped off sharply in every direction as you moved away from that pump. There was a workhouse nearby with over 500 residents, but the workhouse had its own private well, and almost none of its residents died. There was a brewery nearby whose workers reported no deaths at all, but the brewery workers were given beer instead of water and had no reason to use the street pump. Every single piece of evidence pointed to the same source. On September the 7th, 1854, a week after Francis Lewis died, John Snow went to the vestry of St. Luke's and presented his findings. He was not believed. Not one physician in that room believed him, not one member of the local authority. The miasma theory was not just a scientific hypothesis, it was orthodoxy. It was what every educated person in England has been taught. It was built into the infrastructure of public health policy. The idea that disease came not through the air but through a water pump that had served that neighbourhood for years, that people trusted, that they drew from every day, was simply too counterintuitive to accept in a single meeting. But Snow was persistent, and eventually, reluctantly, the local council agreed to do one thing. They removed the handle from the Broad Street pump, took it off, made the pump unusable. and the outbreak, which was already declining by this point as people had begun leaving the neighborhood, subsided. The pump without a handle became one of the most famous objects in the history of medicine. Today, on the corner of what is now called Broadwick Street in London, there is a replica of that handleless pump, and directly next to it is a pub, named with appropriate affection the John Snow. But here is the part of the story that I find almost unbearable to sit with. John Snow was right, completely demonstrably, provably right, and the London Board of Health, after investigating his findings and reviewing his evidence, published their official conclusion about the cause of the 1854 Soho outbreak. Their conclusion was miasma. They looked at his map, they reviewed his interviews, they examined his data, and they concluded it was still the bad air. I want you to hold that for a second. Not as a reason to feel superior to the Victorians, not as an opportunity for easy judgment from a distance of 170 years, but as a reminder of something that I think is genuinely important. Truth, even thoroughly documented, carefully observed, rigorously argued truth, does not automatically win. It has to fight against the weight of consensus, against the investment powerful people have in the current explanation, against the very human desire to not be told that everything you thought you knew was wrong. John Snow spent the rest of his life fighting for his theory. He died 4 years after the Soho outbreak at 45 years old from a stroke. He never saw his ideas fully accepted. He never received the recognition his work deserved while he was alive. It was only after Louis Pasteur's work on germ theory in the 1860s formally explained the mechanism behind what Snow had observed only once. There was a complete scientific framework that could absorb and explain the evidence that the medical world finally fully conceded. Water, not air, water. Not. Now here is something I want to tell you about Snow's story that most tellings leave out. He was not alone. At almost exactly the same time in Vienna, a Hungarian physician named Ignaz Semmelweis was fighting his own version of the same war, and his story is in some ways even more devastating. Vienna General Hospital, 1846. Semmelweis was a young obstetrician, assigned to the hospital's first maternity clinic, the division staffed by doctors and medical students. The second clinic was staffed by midwives. The difference in outcomes between these two clinics was by any reasonable measure a medical emergency. In the first clinic, the doctor's clinic, the maternal mortality rate from childbed fever, which we now know as streptococcal infection, ran as high as 10 to 18%. Think about that number. Nearly 1 in 5 women who entered that clinic to give birth were dying. In the midwives' clinic next door, about 2%. Same hospital, same patients more or less. The only variable was who was delivering the babies. Semmelweis was determined to understand why. He tried everything. He changed the position in which women gave birth. He investigated whether the presence of the priest who walked through the ward ringing a bell, performing last rites as women lay dying, might be causing sufficient terror to weaken the body's defences. He got nowhere. Then in 1847 a colleague and friend named Jakob Kolechka accidentally nicked himself with a scalpel during an autopsy. A few days later, Kolechka was dead, with exactly the same symptoms as the women dying of childbed fever, and Semmelweis standing over his friend's body in the same dissection room where medical students spent their mornings, before going directly to the maternity ward to deliver babies understood. The doctors were doing autopsies. They were not washing their hands, and they were carrying something from the corpses to the women in labour. Something invisible. Something lethal. He did not know what it was. Germ theory did not yet exist. He called it somewhat poetically cadaverous particles. But he knew what it required. Wash your hands. He implemented a hand-washing protocol immediately. Every doctor, every medical student required to wash their hands in a solution of chlorinated lime to scrub until the smell of the dissection room was completely gone from their skin. The mortality rate in his clinic dropped from 18% to less than 2% in a matter of months. Less than 2%. The same as the midwives. He had effectively eliminated childbed fever from his ward by teaching people to wash their hands, and the response of the Vienna medical establishment to this achievement: rejection. Outright insulted, furious rejection, because the implication of Semmelweis's finding was unbearable. If he was right, then the doctors, the educated men, the elite practitioners of the most prestigious medical faculty in Europe were the ones killing their patients. They were walking into the ward with death on their hands, literally. Doctors were offended at the suggestion, deeply personally offended. To acknowledge Semmelweis would be to admit that their own unwashed hands had killed hundreds or thousands of women. So they did not acknowledge him. They mocked him. They dismissed his results. They found procedural objections. They suggested his statistics were flawed. And eventually they removed him from his position. The tragedy of Ignaz Semmelweis is not simply that he was right and was ignored. It is that he was right was ignored. Watched women continue to die because he was ignored and broke under the weight of it. He became increasingly angry, then erratic. He wrote letters to European obstetricians calling them murderers. He described his colleagues as responsible for a massacre. He was not wrong. But the way he said it burned every bridge he had left. In 1865, at the age of 47, Semmelweis was committed to a mental asylum by his colleagues. He was beaten by the guards. He died 14 days later from sepsis, a blood infection. The same disease he had spent his career trying to prevent. I have to stop here for a moment, because I find the story of Semmelweis genuinely difficult to tell without some emotional weight. This is a man who understood something profoundly true, who proved it with data that was by any measure compelling, who tried to share it, who was destroyed for trying, and who died of the very thing he had dedicated his life to fighting in a place where no one was washing their hands. There is something in that story that feels almost mythological in its cruelty. The healer undone by the very wound he spent his life treating. But here is what I keep coming back to. Semmelweis died in 1865. Louis Pasteur published the complete germ theory between 1861 and 1864. Joseph Lister began developing antiseptic surgical technique in 1867. Semmelweis was right on the edge of the moment when everything changed. He lived just long enough to be destroyed by the old world, and not quite long enough to see the new one validate everything he had ever said. Here is the question I want to ask you, and I want you to think about it honestly. If you had been a doctor in Vienna in 1847, and a young colleague came to you and said, "I believe we're killing our patients because we're not washing our hands before delivering babies," what would your first reaction have been? Would it have been to say, "Tell me more, show me the evidence"? Or would it have been something closer to, "That is a very serious accusation. Are you saying I am responsible for these deaths?" I think most of us, if we are honest, might find the second reaction more familiar than the first, because none of us love being told that something we've been doing confidently with training and expertise and professional pride might have been causing harm. That is not a failing unique to Victorian doctors. That is a human thing. What Semmelweis and Snow together represent those two stubborn, difficult, visionary men fighting in different cities at the same decade is the pivot point of the entire history of hygiene. The moment when the long journey from ash and pumice stones and river baths and Roman aqueducts and medieval linens and plague terror and perfumed courts, all of it finally found its scientific foundation. They did not win their battles immediately. They did not live to see full victory, but they were right. And once Louis Pasteur gave the world the framework to understand why they were right, Once the invisible world of bacteria and pathogens became visible through science, everything changed. Not slowly, not gradually, in a generation. The idea that washing your hands was a nicety, that bathing was a luxury, that clean water was an aesthetic preference rather than a matter of life and death. All of that dissolved remarkably quickly under the weight of evidence that was now impossible to ignore. The 19th century revolution in hygiene, the sewer systems, the clean water legislation, the germ theory, the public health movements is one of the greatest single improvements in human life expectancy in all of recorded history. But none of it would have happened without the two questions those two men refused to stop asking. What is actually making people sick? And could something as simple as washing your hands make a difference? The answer, of course, was yes. It always had been. Humanity had been instinctively washing itself for 40,000 years before Semmelweis was born. What changed in the 19th century was not the practice, it was the proof. But here is where the story takes one final, fascinating, uncomfortable turn. Because once we had the proof, once science told us definitively that cleanliness prevents disease, a new industry arose to tell us exactly how clean we needed to be. And that industry had a somewhat different agenda than public health. It had a commercial one. The story of soap and the extraordinary campaign that turned daily bathing from a personal choice into a moral obligation, and what that campaign quietly did to the world beyond wealthy Western nations, is one of the most surprising chapters in this entire story. And we're going there right after this. So science finally gave us the answer. Germ theory, waterborne disease, the invisible world of bacteria and pathogens that had been killing people for millennia without anyone understanding why. By the 1880s, the evidence was overwhelming. Clean water prevents disease. Washing your hands prevents the spread of infection. Personal hygiene is not a luxury or a moral statement. It is a matter of survival. You might think at this point that the story simplifies, that the rest is just progress. Clean pipes better plumbing the spread of soap through communities, a gradual improvement in public health. And in many ways you would be right. But the full story of how modern hygiene was sold to the world is more complicated, more commercially driven, more morally tangled, and frankly more interesting than the clean narrative of scientific triumph suggests. Let me take you to England in 1886. Thomas Barrett, the advertising director of a soap company called Pears, had a problem. Pears had been making soap since 1807, an elegant transparent bar developed by a London barber named Andrew Pears as a gentle product for refined English skin. It was good soap, genuinely good soap by the standards of its era. But the market for soap in Victorian Britain was still remarkably limited. Most working-class people did not buy soap regularly. Many could not afford it, and even those who could had not developed the habit of daily use because daily bathing was not yet a cultural expectation. Barrett's job was to change that, not just to advertise a product, to create a need, to convince people that they required something they had previously considered optional. The campaign he launched was one of the most consequential in the history of modern marketing. First, he recruited the Reverend Henry Ward Beecher, one of the most famous and trusted religious voices in the English-speaking world on both sides of the Atlantic. Beecher publicly endorsed Pears' soap, with a statement that became one of the most repeated lines in Victorian advertising. If cleanliness is next to godliness, then soap must be considered as a means of grace. Think about what that sentence is doing. It is not saying soap is useful for removing germs. It is not saying soap reduces illness and improves public health. It is saying soap is a spiritual practice. Using soap brings you closer to God. Not using soap puts a distance between you and the divine. The medicinal argument could be resisted. The spiritual argument was far harder to push back on. Then Barrett did something even more audacious. He purchased a painting by the celebrated English artist John Everett Millais. The painting was called Bubbles, a portrait of Millet's grandson, a beautiful curly-haired child gazing up at a soap bubble floating in the air. Gentle, innocent, perfectly crafted to evoke childhood purity and wonder. Barrett added one element to the painting, a bar of Pear's soap placed in the foreground of the image, and then he ran the image in every major newspaper and magazine in Britain. Millais was reportedly furious at the commercial appropriation of his work. The public, however, was enchanted. The campaign made Pear's soap into one of the most recognized brands in the world. And more importantly, it changed how people thought about soap itself. Before these campaigns, soap was a commodity, something you bought in bulk like flour or salt with no particular brand attachment. After Barrett's campaigns, soap was an identity, something that said something about who you were, your class, your values, your relationship with God, and the phrase, "Have you used Pear's soap?" became so widespread in British culture that people used it sarcastically for years to describe shameless promotional language. At the same time, across the Atlantic, something very similar was happening. William Procter, a candle maker from England, and James Gamble, a soap maker from Ireland, had married sisters and gone into business together in Cincinnati, Ohio. In 1879, their company introduced Ivory Soap, a pure white floating bar, with a purity claim of 99 44% pure, that became one of the most famous marketing lines in American history. The floating part, by the way, was apparently an accident. A worker forgot to turn off a mixing machine during a lunch break and too much air got whipped into a batch. The bars floated in water. Instead of discarding the batch, Procter and Gamble shipped it. The public loved it, and the floating bar became a feature, not a flaw. But here is where this story gets genuinely uncomfortable. Because the expansion of the soap industry in the late 19th century was not just a story of entrepreneurship and clever advertising, it was also a story of empire. And the two things were woven together in a way that is impossible to honestly tell without acknowledging. By the 1880s, the major soap manufacturers' peers in Britain, Lever Brothers, which would eventually become Unilever, required vast quantities of palm oil and vegetable fats as raw material. Those raw materials came primarily from West Africa, and the colonization of West Africa, the extraction of its resources, the exploitation of its land and its people, was in part the economic engine that made mass soap production possible. William Lever, who founded Lever Brothers in 1885 and became one of the wealthiest industrialists in England, was also one of the most aggressive advocates for British colonial expansion in Africa. He needed the palm oil. The palm oil was in Congo and West Africa, and the most efficient way to obtain it was through colonial control. But the connection between soap and imperialism did not stop at the supply chain. It extended into the advertising itself. In the 1890s, Pear's soap ran a series of advertisements that are among the most historically notorious in the history of marketing. One advertisement, which appeared in major publications on both sides of the Atlantic, depicted a British naval officer washing his hands with Pear's soap while colonized people observed. The text at the bottom read, and I am going to quote this directly because it needs to be heard precisely, "The first step towards lightening the white man's burden is through teaching the virtues of cleanliness. Pear's soap is a potent factor in brightening the dark corners of the earth as civilization advances." Let that settle for a moment. The same bar of soap that was being sold to English housewives on the basis of godliness and purity was being sold in the same era as a tool of imperial conquest. Cleanliness was civilization. Civilization was white. And anyone who did not use this soap was by implication not yet fully human. I want to be careful here because the full picture is genuinely complicated. The scientific argument for soap that clean hands prevent disease, that clean bodies are healthier bodies, was and is true. The expansion of soap use across the 19th and 20th centuries genuinely saved lives. Rates of infectious disease dropped. Child mortality fell. The public health benefits were real and significant. None of that is in dispute. But the way that soap was sold, the framework that was constructed around it, the ideology that was loaded onto it was doing something else alongside the public health work. It was encoding cleanliness as a racial and cultural hierarchy. It was suggesting that people who practiced different hygiene traditions, the hammam bathers of the Islamic world, the river bathing communities of Africa and Asia, the indigenous peoples of the Americas with their own centuries-old purification practices were primitive, uncivilized, in need of rescue. And this framing was not accidental, it was commercially useful. Because if the people who did not use your product were not just unclean but culturally inferior, then selling soap to them was not just commerce, it was charity, progress, civilization. And if a company could position its product as the physical embodiment of that narrative, it had an essentially limitless market. Here is what I find genuinely fascinating about this, and I want to hear what you think about it too. The soap industry of the late 19th century understood something that public health advocates often struggle with. Behavior change is hard. Telling people that germs cause disease does not automatically make them wash their hands. But telling people that soap is what separates the civilized from the uncivilized, that taps into something much more powerful than the fear of illness. It taps into identity, into status, into the desire to be seen as a particular kind of person. And once cleanliness became an identity marker, once the question was not, will I get sick if I don't wash? But what kind of person am I if I don't wash? The market for personal hygiene products became effectively unlimited. The decades that followed saw an extraordinary explosion of hygiene products, each building on the same basic architecture. Toothpaste companies told consumers that the thin film coating their teeth after eating a normal biological phenomenon that dentists today actually consider partially protective was called the film and was destroying their social lives. Mouthwash companies invented the clinical-sounding term halitosis in the 1920s to describe bad breath, a condition that had existed forever but had never before been framed as a medical problem requiring a purchase solution. Deodorant companies spent decades convincing American consumers that perspiration itself, the body's normal thermoregulation mechanism, was not just unpleasant, but socially catastrophic. A Lifebuoy soap campaign in the 1930s popularized the phrase body odor, often abbreviated to just those two letters, and turned it into one of the most socially powerful phrases in American advertising. The slogan "knocks out body odor" was so effective that the abbreviation itself became a cultural shorthand for social failure. Something the human body had been doing for 40,000 years was now suddenly a problem that required a daily product to solve. I want to be very clear about something here. I'm not saying soap is bad. I'm not saying personal hygiene is a scam. Soap genuinely prevents disease. Hand washing genuinely saves lives. The reduction in infectious illness that followed the spread of soap use in the 20th century was one of the great public health achievements in human history. What I am saying is something more subtle. The line between this product improves your health and this product defines your worth as a human being was deliberately blurred. And once that line was blurred, it became very hard to think about cleanliness clearly. To ask honestly how clean is actually clean enough. How often does a healthy body actually need to be washed? What happens when the definition of clean is set not by medical science, but by the company trying to sell you something? These are not rhetorical questions. They are questions that scientists are actually asking right now. And the answers, it turns out, are genuinely surprising. Because while the 19th century was busy building a commercial empire on the back of cleanliness, some of the most interesting science of the late 20th and early 21st centuries has been quietly asking whether we overcorrected, whether in our rush to be as clean as possible we stripped something away that we needed, whether the human microbiome, the vast community of bacteria, fungi and microorganisms that live on and in our bodies, and that play an essential role in immune function, digestion, mental health, and dozens of other processes we're only beginning to understand needs a certain level of exposure to the world in order to function properly. Whether the children who grow up in ultra-clean environments, never getting their hands in dirt, never playing in the mud, never encountering the full spectrum of environmental microorganisms, whether those children statistically are more likely to develop allergies, asthma and autoimmune conditions, whether the hygienic practices we were sold as medical necessities are in some cases actively interfering with biology that was working fine before we started selling it a problem. That question, the final, most current, most personally relevant chapter of this entire story, is where we are headed next. You know what I find genuinely funny about where this story has taken us? We started around a campfire 40,000 years ago with a Neanderthal using seashell tweezers to remove parasites from their hair, and we have travelled through Egyptian priests bathing 4 times daily, through Roman aqueducts delivering 1,000 litres per person per day, through medieval bathhouses packed with people eating dinner in their tubs, through the plague years when water became the enemy, through the Islamic hammam that kept the tradition alive for centuries, through the perfumed courts of Versailles, through Jon Snow and Ignaz Semmelweis, and the slow, painful triumph of germ theory. And where has that 10,000-year journey deposited us? At a point where some of the world's leading dermatologists and microbiologists are quietly suggesting that we might have overcorrected. That in our determination to be as clean as possible, we may have stripped away something our bodies actually needed. That the squeaky clean feeling we were sold as the definition of healthy skin might in some cases be the sound of our body's defences being dismantled. I find that genuinely fascinating, and a little humbling, and honestly pretty funny. Let me give you the science properly, because this is a story that deserves to be told carefully. In 1989, a British epidemiologist named David Strachan published a study that would become one of the most discussed papers in modern public health. He had been analysing data from 17,000 British children born in 1958, and he noticed something puzzling. Children who grew up with more older siblings were significantly less likely to develop hay fever and other allergic conditions. More siblings meant more exposure to the germs that older children bring home from school, from playgrounds, from the general business of existing in the world. More exposure to infections, less allergy. Strachan proposed that something about early microbial exposure was protecting the immune system from developing the kind of misdirected responses that produce allergies. He called it the hygiene hypothesis. And the implications once people started pulling on that thread turned out to be far larger than hay fever. Since the 1960s, the rates of multiple sclerosis, Crohn's disease type 1, diabetes, asthma, eczema, and a wide range of food allergies have risen by 300% or more in Western industrialized nations. 300%. In the same period, rates of infectious diseases, measles, mumps, tuberculosis, various parasitic infections have dropped dramatically thanks to vaccines, antibiotics, and improved sanitation. The statistical correlation is striking. As infections went down, immune disorders went up. One of the leading theories for why this happened involves what some researchers call our old friends microorganisms that have lived alongside humans for hundreds of thousands of years. Not the pathogens that make us sick. The organisms that quietly trained our immune systems to behave correctly. Bacteria that colonized human guts and skin before we even understood what bacteria were. parasites that our immune systems learn to tolerate, and in the process of learning that tolerance developed the regulatory machinery to avoid attacking their own tissues and harmless environmental proteins. The argument roughly is this: the human immune system evolved in a world full of microorganisms. It needed exposure to diverse microbial life, especially in early childhood, to learn the difference between something that requires a response and something that does not. Strip away that diversity through over-cleaning, over-prescribing antibiotics, spending childhood in antiseptic environments, eating diets that limit the range of organisms reaching the gut, and the immune system in its bored and under-challenged state begins to attack things it should ignore. Pollen, peanuts, its own tissues. Now, I want to be responsible here because the hygiene hypothesis is genuinely complicated and the science is still evolving. Multiple research teams have pushed back on the simplest version of the story. One large study in Germany, the Paula study, looked specifically at household cleanliness habits and their relationship to allergy development, and found somewhat surprisingly that personal and domestic hygiene practices were not significantly linked to allergy risk, which suggests that the story is more nuanced than people who shower less often have fewer allergies. The current scientific consensus is something closer to this. It is not cleanliness per se that seems to be the problem. It is the loss of specific microbial diversity, particularly in early childhood, and particularly in the gut, that correlates with the rise in immune disorders. And that loss has many drivers, not just soap. Antibiotic use in the first year of life has been strongly linked to asthma and allergic diseases. Caesarean section delivery, which means the baby does not pass through the birth canal and does not receive the mother's vaginal microbiome, at the moment of birth has been associated with increased allergy risk. Western diets depleted of the diverse plant fibers that feed beneficial gut bacteria play a significant role. The sharp decline of time children spend outdoors in contact with soil and animals, and the full spectrum of environmental microorganisms matters enormously. Children who grow up on farms consistently show dramatically lower rates of asthma and allergies in study after study across multiple countries. Something about farm life, the animals, the soil, the hay, the raw milk, all of it together seems to provide exactly the kind of diverse microbial exposure that the immune system needs. And here is where the skin microbiome becomes specifically relevant. Because your skin is not just a barrier, it is an ecosystem. A healthy human body hosts somewhere between 2 and 10 million distinct bacteria on its skin alone, not as a sign of uncleanliness, as a sign of health. These organisms, primarily species of Staphylococcus crinobacterium and dozens of others, form a community called the skin microbiome. They feed on the oils and dead skin cells that your body constantly produces. They help maintain the slightly acidic environment of the skin's surface, something called the acid mantle, that makes it inhospitable to genuinely harmful pathogens. In other words, the invisible ecosystem living on your skin is part of your immune system. And here is where the overwashing question becomes interesting. Dermatologists now largely agree that daily showering with harsh soap, particularly with hot water, has measurable effects on the skin microbiome. It strips away the sebum, the skin's naturally produced oil that many of those beneficial organisms depend on for food. It disrupts the acid mantle. It temporarily removes the microbial communities that have been carefully established over years. For most people with healthy skin in temperate climates who are not doing physically demanding work, the medical evidence for daily full-body washing with soap is actually surprisingly limited. The claim that most Americans and Europeans make that daily showering is a health necessity is not particularly well supported by the medical literature. It is supported extremely well by 100 years of soap advertising. A journalist named James Hamblin wrote a fascinating book about this exact question. He spent 5 years gradually stopping the use of soap and personal care products on his body, though he continued washing his hands with soap regularly to explore what happened to his skin. What he found was at first uncomfortable. His skin smelled different. His scalp produced excess oil as it overcompensated for the absence of daily stripping. But after several months, something shifted. His skin became less oily, not more. The overproduction stopped. The eczema he had struggled with became less frequent. His conclusion, which he shared with some careful nuance, was that the skin has a regulatory system, and that system works better when it is not constantly being disrupted and forced to compensate. This is not an argument for never washing. This is not a recommendation. Hamblin himself was explicit about that this is deeply personal and context-dependent, but it does raise a question that I think is worth sitting with. How much of what we consider normal hygiene, the daily shower, the shampooing of hair every other day, the application of 14 products before leaving the house, is genuinely good for our health, and how much of it was invented by people trying to sell us something? This is not a rhetorical question. The frequency of recommended shampooing has changed multiple times over the 20th century, often in ways that correlated suspiciously with new product launches from hair care companies. The concept of squeaky clean, that sensation of stripped skin and hair that we have been taught to associate with cleanliness, is, as dermatologists now explain, actually a sign that the skin's protective oils have been removed. Healthy skin should not feel squeaky. It should feel comfortable. And yet the squeaky feeling is what we were conditioned to desire because companies needed us to use their product every single day rather than every few days. Here is where I want to offer a genuinely balanced thought, because I do not want to leave you with the impression that soap is a scam or that the hygiene revolution was a mistake. It was not. Clean drinking water and effective hand washing have saved more human lives than any medical intervention in history. The reduction in childhood mortality from waterborne diseases, the elimination of cholera in Western cities, the dramatic fall in deaths from infected wounds after surgery, the prevention of spread during pandemic events. All of that is real. All of that is enormous. All of that matters. The point is not that cleanliness is bad. The point is that the question, how clean is clean enough, is one that the hygiene industry has a financial interest in answering in a very specific direction, and that the human body, which evolved over hundreds of thousands of years in a world full of dirt and microorganisms and animals and rivers and soil, has its own answer to that question, and that answer does not always match what is printed on the back of a shampoo bottle. And this finally is the deepest thread running through this entire story. From the Neanderthal who carried a seashell tweezer 40,000 years ago, to the Egyptian priest bathing at midnight before the dawn prayer, to the Roman merchant soaking in the caldarium while debating business contracts, to the medieval washerwoman on the riverbank with one eye on the water and one on the crocodiles, to Ignaz Semmelweis scrubbing his hands with chlorinated lime and watching his patients survive. Every person in this story was answering the same fundamental question with the tools and knowledge available to them. What does it mean to take care of this body I was given? How do I protect it? How do I honor it? How do I keep it clean in every sense of that word? The answers have been radically different across time and culture and wealth and circumstance, but the question has never changed. And the desire behind it, the deep biological, profoundly human desire to be clean, to be presentable, to take care of yourself, that desire is 40,000 years old and has never once flickered out. Not during the plague years, not in the perfumed courts, not in the poorest villages of the medieval world, not even in the centuries when people were so afraid of water that they rubbed themselves with alcohol-soaked cloths and carried bundles of herbs near their faces to breathe through. The desire was always there, working with whatever they had. knowing whatever they knew, doing the best they could. Just like you are tonight washing your face before bed after watching a 12-part history of the thing you are doing, and that I think is the part that will stay with me long after the history fades. Not the Roman aqueducts, not the plague, not the soap advertisements, just the continuity, the unbroken thread of human beings across every era and every civilization and every level of knowledge and every amount of suffering and every kind of joy, caring about their bodies, caring about how they showed up in the world, caring in the end about dignity. We're almost at the end of this journey, but there is one final chapter left, one that brings everything together: the ancient instinct, the Victorian science, the commercial revolution, the microbiome research, all of it, and asks the question that I think this entire story has been building toward. What does all of this history actually teach us about how to live right now? Not in some abstract philosophical sense, but practically, today. What do we actually know after 40,000 years of human experimentation about how to stay clean, and what does clean even mean when we understand the full complexity of the question? That is where we are heading next. 40,000 years, that is how long this journey has taken. From a Neanderthal pressing a seashell tweezer to their skin on a cold hillside somewhere in prehistoric Europe, to you right now lying in bed with a phone or a speaker nearby, listening to a story about the thing all of us do every single day without thinking twice. I want to take the final few minutes of this journey to do something a little different, not just to summarize what we have learned, but to actually sit with it, to ask what 40,000 years of human experimentation with cleanliness genuinely teaches us, not as a philosophical exercise, but as something practically personally useful. Because I think this history contains real wisdom, the kind that only becomes visible when you look at the whole arc. The first thing that strikes me, having spent time with all of these stories, is this: almost every hygiene mistake in history came from the same source. Not ignorance, not laziness, not a lack of caring. It came from certainty. The miasma theorists were not stupid. They were some of the most educated people in their world, and they were completely, absolutely certain they were right. The doctors who rejected Semmelweis were not cruel men. They were confident ones, confident in the framework they had inherited, confident that a young Hungarian upstart could not possibly be telling them something they had missed. The soap companies that convinced an entire culture to wash daily were not lying exactly. They were selling something they genuinely believed in. They just also happened to profit from that belief, and in each case the certainty was the problem, not the bathing or the not bathing, not the soap or the lack of soap. The inability to ask honestly, what do I actually know here and what have I been told? The second thing this history teaches me is about resilience. The desire to be clean, to take care of the body, to present oneself with some form of dignity, has survived every catastrophe human civilization has ever experienced. It survived the fall of Rome. It survived the Black Death. It survived centuries of poverty and scarcity and genuine grinding hardship. When people could not bathe, they changed their linen. When they could not change their linen, they washed their face and hands. When they could not do that, they found herbs to mask the smell and combs to pull through their hair. There is something quietly extraordinary about that persistence. The impulse to care for yourself is so deeply woven into what it means to be human that it finds expression even at the extremes of what human life can become. I find that genuinely moving. The third lesson is the one I keep returning to most, which is that cleanliness has never really been just about health. For the Egyptians, it was about the soul's worthiness for eternity. For the Greeks, it was about civic virtue and the respect you owe your community. For the Romans, it was about equality, that brief, beautiful democratic moment in the Caldarium where everyone was wet and naked and temporarily the same. For the medieval communities around their bathhouses, it was about connection, the social fabric of a shared ritual dinner in a tub, gossip and laughter rising with the steam. For the Islamic world, it was about standing clean before God 5 times a day, a constant gentle reminder that the body and the spirit are not separate things. None of these people primarily thought about bacteria. None of them understood germ theory. And yet they understood something about cleanliness that we sometimes lose in our more clinical, more product-driven relationship with it. That taking care of your body is an act of self-respect. That how you present yourself says something about what you think of yourself. That the ritual of washing, whatever form it takes in your culture, your household, your personal life, is not just a health behavior. It is a small daily ceremony of taking yourself seriously, and here is where the science and the philosophy converge in a way that I find deeply satisfying. Modern microbiome research is telling us essentially that the body has its own wisdom, that the skin knows what it needs, that the gut knows what it needs, that the immune system, given the right environment and the right early exposures, largely knows how to regulate itself, and that our job is not to override that wisdom with industrial quantities of products. Our job is to support it, to work with the body's systems rather than constantly fighting them. Wash your hands before eating. Wash them after contact with raw meat or after using the bathroom. Wash the genuinely grimy parts after genuine grime. But maybe do not scrub your entire body with antibacterial soap every single morning out of habit rather than need. Maybe let children play in dirt. Maybe reconsider how often any given part of you actually needs soap versus just warm water and gentle rinsing. Maybe notice whether what you are calling clean is actually healthy, or whether you have been conditioned to associate a stripped and slightly irritated feeling with purity because someone needed to sell you a second bottle. Does any of this resonate with you? I am genuinely curious. Because I think this might be one of those topics where almost everyone has a strong intuition, but almost nobody has had the chance to think through where that intuition came from. If you grew up in a household where daily showering was non-negotiable, was that based on genuine health reasoning, or was it just what everyone did? If you feel uncomfortable going a day without washing your hair, is that discomfort physical or is it social? If you reach for antibacterial soap, automatically are you actually protecting yourself, or are you repeating a behavior that was normalized by 70 years of marketing? I am not telling you any of these behaviors are wrong. I am just suggesting that the history we have walked through tonight might be a useful lens for examining them. Because humans have been asking these exact questions in every possible cultural and scientific context for 40,000 years. And the most consistent answer across all that time and all that variation is something closer to use your judgment. Know your circumstances. Work with your body rather than against it. Respect the ritual, whatever form it takes for you. And wash your hands. That one at least Semmelweis died for. And the science has never wavered. Let me leave you with one final image. It is 1854, and a doctor is standing on a street corner in Soho at dusk. He has spent the past week knocking on doors, gathering data, talking to grieving families, and building an argument that he knows most of his colleagues will reject. He has a map in his coat pocket, a map with black bars stacked on addresses, a map that tells a story nobody wants to hear. He goes to the parish council. He is not believed. He asks them anyway to remove a pump handle, and they do, and something terrible is interrupted. Not stopped forever, not solved, but interrupted. By one person who was willing to look clearly at the evidence in front of him and follow it where it led. That is, I think, the real lesson of this whole story. Not the aqueducts, not the hammams, not the soap companies or the miasma theory or the medieval bathhouses. The lesson is that every advance in human cleanliness, every genuine improvement in human health came from the same place. Someone willing to look honestly at what was actually happening, to question what everyone assumed was true, to follow the evidence even when it was inconvenient, even when it implicated them, even when nobody believed them yet. That's how Semmelweis saved thousands of mothers. That is how snow ended a cholera outbreak. That is how Pasteur gave us germ theory. That is how every piece of knowledge we currently carry about how to keep ourselves healthy was won. From people who were willing to stay curious, to keep asking, to not be satisfied with the comfortable answer. And maybe that is the thing we carry from tonight into tomorrow. Not a specific showering frequency, not a product recommendation, not a verdict on the Victorians or the Romans or the medieval peasants or the Sun King. Just an invitation to stay curious about what you think you know, about your own body, about your own habits, about where the things you take for granted actually came from. Because as this story shows, the people who were most certain were often the most wrong, and the people who kept asking questions, even uncomfortable ones, even ones that made their colleagues angry, even ones that led them somewhere strange and surprising, those people are the ones who moved the whole thing forward, for all of us, for 40,000 years. Well, my friend, you made it to the end of something genuinely enormous. 40,000 years of human hygiene in one night. I hope something in this journey stayed with you. Maybe it was the Egyptian priest bathing by starlight before the dawn prayer. Maybe it was Erasmus writing in 1526 that the bathhouses had vanished and the world had changed. Maybe it was that simple, devastating image of Semmelweis, the man who discovered the power of washing your hands dying of an infection because nobody washed their hands. Or maybe it was just the thread running through all of it. The ordinary, stubborn, beautiful human insistence on caring, on showing up as clean as circumstances allow, on taking the body seriously, on treating yourself as worth looking after. That thread has never broken. And I find that after all the plagues and the theories and the catastrophes and the commerce and the science, genuinely quietly hopeful. If this journey meant something to you tonight, it would mean a great deal to me if you would leave a comment and share whatever piece of this story surprised you most. I read every one, and if you've been here for the whole journey, all 12 parts, then honestly, thank you. Not in a formal channel management way, but genuinely. You gave this story hours of your evening. You let it sit with you in the quiet. That is not a small thing. There are more stories waiting. Stories about how humanity built its cities and how those cities have shaped who we are. Stories about the foods that changed the world. Stories about the invisible forces, the diseases, the ideas, the accidents of geography and timing that bent the arc of history in directions nobody expected. Stories told the same way we told this one. Slowly, honestly. With every detail I could find that was true and strange and worth staying up a little later for. I will see you there. Sleep well.